Empire Amont the princess stared out the window. She wasn't even surprised herself because she wasn't sad at all. She sighed heavily and told herself that it was even easier than she imagined. A moment later, she saw the emperor standing before her, entering her chambers. Karl Ulrich Egmont looked closely at the empress as he wanted to tell her a lot of things. The empress looked at the emperor in surprise and intently. His gaze puzzled her greatly. The emperor looked at her and angrily asked where she was going. The empress looked at him but said nothing. He came closer to her and shouted angrily. He said that he was talking to her and asked again where she was going. The empress turned away from him because he frightened her. She did not answer him. The emperor looked at her with fury and grabbed her by the shoulders. He asked if she was really leaving for him. The emperor asked if she was really leaving for Lionel Valdor. The emperor was furious and out of his mind. The empress understood that even now the emperor did not understand what should really matter. She asked with disdain, did it matter who she was leaving for? For her, it was not the main thing. What was important was that she no longer wanted to be near him. He shouted angrily that she was the empress and should be next to him. She looked at him with contempt and asked if she was really an empress to him. She asked if he really called her that after he himself had overthrown her. She looked at him and said with a smirk that although it was even better this way, she didn't want to say anything else. She said that even if he had not bundled her up, then someday she would still have said these words. She said that the place next to him was now free. The emperor froze in shock at her words. He didn't expect her to say something like that. She looked at him and said that she was giving up the title of empress. Adelaide Gotroff, a high-class striker that is an attacking mage who specializes in repairing tower damage. She is capable of clearing the entire tower single-handedly. Crown Princess of the Gotroff Empire. Madame looked at her daughter and said that they had received a letter with an offer from the emperor, and now she could become empress. She looked at her mother and said that she must be so worried that she didn't want to leave her here. The lady looking at her daughter said that she thought she would react approvingly. She asked her what happened. She came closer to her daughter and asked if she didn't regret that day every time she was having a hard time. Madame said that then if she had left her brother Lucio to die, she would have become Empress Gotroff. The madam looked at her daughter and said that she had a duty to her only brother. Looking at her daughter, she said that of course she would be devoted to her brother. The lady looked at her daughter and asked what would happen to her future children. She asked what would happen to those close to her. Madame S. asked her daughter if she thought that everyone shared her position. The madam looked at her daughter and said that her existence was extremely dangerous for the empire. She told her that for the sake of her home, for the sake of her brother, she had to leave and abandon the empire, and in the end, that's what she did. The princess opened the box and saw a photograph of the emperor, Karl Ulrich Egmont, the current ruler of the Egmont Empire, and the man she is to marry. A moment later, she also saw a letter which contained information about the emperor's concubine. The princess knew that she had left her native land, crossed the Blue Sea, and arrived on this continent. But she was still irritated because she was in a foreign land where there was no one she could trust. At the same time, the emperor was sitting in his office and reading documents. He studied information about the new empress. The emperor wondered if the photo one sends to one's future husband should not be taken while sitting with a sweet smile on one's face. He knew that by this, she was hinting that she was coming here, not as his woman, but as an empress. The emperor sighed heavily and said that the photograph did not even convey all her audacity. He was very sad because it would have been good if she had come here as his wife. The princess looked out the window intently. She was examining the territory. A month later, Lionel Belder is the second son of the Balder family Minister of Defense of the Vermont Empire and Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Army. The knight told Lionel that it seemed the crew had arrived. Lionel said that he had also seen everything and needed to go carefully to check everything. He spurred his horse and raced towards the young lady with lightning speed. The crown princess, sitting in the carriage, heard a strange noise from outside. She slowly looked out the window and saw the knights rushing towards her at full speed. Adelaide asked her companion how much longer they had to go. The woman said that they were now passing through the first gate. Madame said they had to go through the second ones. So about another hour, the crown princess thought for a moment. Lionel walked slowly towards the carriage where the crown princess was. Approaching the carriage, he saw Madame Yu, in turn, nodded, and thereby showed that he could knock. He said that he was the Minister of Defense of the Empire and the Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Army, and his name was Lionel Balder. He told the Crown Princess that he would accompany her. Madame told her that when she was ready, she would open the door. A moment later, the young man opened the door. He froze in surprise, as he did not expect to see such a crown princess. He stared into her golden eyes without looking away. Looking at the young lady, he was taken aback and asked for forgiveness. A moment later, the commander-in-chief extended his hand to the crown princess. The crown princess slowly stepped out of the carriage, her hair fluttering in the wind. Lionel Z froze in surprise when her hair touched his face. The commander-in-chief was very surprised and could not take his gaze off the crown princess as he was surprised by her clothes. Adelaide looked at the commander-in-chief and thanked him for meeting her. She introduced herself and said that her name was Adelaide Godroof. The commander-in-chief looked at the crown princess and said again that his name was Lionel Balder. They stared at each other for a moment, not looking away. The young lady turned around and saw the knights watching them intently without moving. She sighed heavily and said that for 2 months now she had been traveling by ship and by carriage, and it was very exhausting. She looked at the commander-in-chief and asked if he had an extra horse by any chance. Lionel S. asked him why she was asking such a question. She smiled and said that she was going to ride. Lionel looked at Adelaide in surprise, and now he understood why she was wearing such clothes for riding. The knights looked at Adelaide and said that the war horses were quite capricious and that it was very dangerous. She laughed and asked the knight if he dared to contradict the Princess of Rodrufa. A moment later, she saddled her horse and galloped toward the gate at full speed. The commander-in-chief looked at the princess in surprise. He didn't expect her to have such a loud voice. He saw that she was sitting in the saddle just perfectly. The princess slowly got off her horse. She playfully patted the horse on the back. A moment later, the commander-in-chief came closer to her and called her. He looked at her and asked with a smile if she was feeling better. Adelaide smiled and thanked him for the opportunity. Adelaide looked at him and said that she thought she needed to change her clothes again, as it was not proper to go to the palace like that. The commander-in-chief looked at her with a smile and said that everything was correct and she could go into the carriage. She looked at him sideways and said that she would do so. Adelaide said that thanks to him, she was able to bear this tiring journey better, and she hoped that they would have another chance to ride together. Lionel looked after the princess with surprise and intentness. The commander-in-chief thought for a moment that such an unusual girl would become empress. Sometime later, the emperor heard a knock at the door. A servant entered and told the emperor that a maid from the ivory palace had arrived. The emperor looked at the maid in surprise and asked what was the matter. The maid bowed to the emperor and said that Her Majesty was asking for help, namely the emperor's sister. The young lady sat in front of a variety of crowns and looked at them all closely. A moment later, she looked at the door in surprise and saw Her Majesty, namely the Grand Duchess Elizabeth Ulrich. Elizabeth is the emperor's half-sister and the only woman in the Ulrich family. The young lady looked at Her Highness the Duchess in surprise. She greeted the Duchess with a smile and asked what brought her to the Ivory Palace. Elizabeth looked at all the tiaras in surprise and asked what they were. She asked if these were gifts from His Majesty. Elizabeth looked at the young lady and asked if she had taken these treasures of the imperial family without asking permission. The young lady looked at her and asked how she dared to do that. She said that she was simply choosing a wedding tiara for Her Majesty the Empress. The Duchess asked, in surprise, what wedding tiara they were talking about, as she was confused by the fact that the concubine was choosing the tiara for the future Empress herself. The Duchess said that if you and the Empire knew about this god roof, you would personally send them a diplomatic protest in writing. The young lady drooped for a moment, but did not answer her. A moment later, the duchesses looked at the young lady and asked, "How about this tiara?" She looked at the young lady and asked if it would not be better to wear the tiara chosen by the duchess rather than by some concubine. The young lady looked at the duchess, and a moment later she laughed. She looked at the duchess and asked her to forgive her because the duchess was the only divorced woman in the entire empire, and she was not sure if the duchess could handle it. The lady said that they knew that in their empire, divorced women had no right to perform marriage ceremonies. The duchess jumped up and asked her how she dared to be insolent to her. A moment later, the emperor came into their room and asked what they were doing. He was very angry. The young lady glanced sideways at the emperor. She was glad that he had finally come, as he had come on time. She came closer to him and called him. The young lady looked at the emperor with tears in her eyes. Elizabeth looked closely at the emperor's concubine. She knew that she, in turn, was just a cunning fox. The emperor looked at his sister with a sharp, angry look and asked what this all meant. Elizabeth looked at the emperor in surprise and asked if he was really taking care of his concubine instead of ruling the empire. Elizabeth told the emperor that he, of course, would not believe her, but she had not done anything reprehensible. The young lady, in turn, cried quietly. The emperor looked at his sister and asked if it was true. He asked why the concubine was crying now. The young lady told the emperor to stop like that, as the duchess had done nothing wrong, and it was all because she was so stupid. She said that she had tried her best to prepare for His Majesty's wedding, but Her Majesty the Duchess did not like it. The Duchess told the emperor that his precious concubine was using the wedding preparations as an excuse to show her influence. Her destiny was to simply watch and say nothing she could not. The emperor said that there was no woman in the imperial family who could prepare for the wedding, and they should be grateful to Diana for doing this. The Duchess looked at the emperor in surprise and asked if he was really now accusing her of being divorced. The emperor told the Duchess that he was warning her for the last time, and that Diana would be in charge of the wedding preparations since he trusted her. The emperor told the Duchess not to dare say anything more, and to simply carry out his order. He asked her if she understood. The Duchess said that she did not wish to look at it anymore, and as soon as the wedding was over, she would immediately return to her estate. The emperor walked slowly towards the exit, as he did not want to continue the conversation any longer. Diana called the emperor in a hurry, but he continued to leave. The young lady glanced sideways at the Duchess, giving her a malicious look. The Duchess froze in place, as she was surprised that a simple concubine of the emperor dared to look at her like that. His Majesty is the sun. The closer someone is to him, the more light they can receive. Diana knew that no matter how much the Duchess said that she was his sister, she could not go against his will. The Duchess was in shock. She couldn't believe that the Emperor believed every word she said. The Duchess wondered if the Empress could stand it. The young lady looked at the Emperor and said that he had to go already. The Emperor sighed heavily and said that he would stay a little longer, as he wanted to lie next to her for a little while longer. The young lady stared at the Emperor without looking away. She thought he was very handsome. She saw the Emperor's beautiful appearance and told herself that he had nothing she could not like. She thought that even his name was perfect. She knew that he belonged to the whole, and she had no desire to share him with anyone. The Emperor stood up and looked at her intently. He was surprised because he noticed that she was crying and looking at him. He looked at her in surprise and called her because he did not understand why she was crying. The young lady, wiping away her tears, asked the Emperor for forgiveness. The Emperor, in turn, asked if she was still sad about what the Duchess had told her. Diana said that it was not so. She looked at him and asked what would happen if the Empress did not like her. Diana asked if she would have to leave the palace In that case, she said that if, of course, it was His Majesty's will, then she would do so. The emperor sighed heavily and said that the empress would not harm her. Diana asked the emperor for forgiveness and said that she probably constantly bothered him. Diana came closer to the emperor and looked at him with a piercing gaze. She said that she had no one but him. She hugged him tightly and said that even after the Empress arrived here, she would like to stay by his side. Diana knew that no one would ever take away any doubts from her. The young man looked at his sister and asked if she even chose clothes for His Majesty. He said that in such a situation, when His Majesty's wedding is just around the corner, she has good control over her emotions. Diana looked at her brother intently and said nothing. A moment later, her gaze fell on the maid. She looked at her and said that she was seeing her for the first time today and told her to raise her head. Diana noticed that she had light hair and bright blue eyes. She looked warily at the maid. A moment later, she told the maids to leave, as she needed to have a little talk with her older brother alone. Diana looked at her brother and said that she thought the blonde with blue eyes should be fired. The young man asked her if she knew how many blondes with blue eyes there were in the world. He asked her how she would choose a maid if she was so selective. She looked at him angrily and told him to do as she said. She asked if he understood her. The young man sighed heavily and said that he understood everything. Diana told him to watch his words around the maids as well. If he didn't do this, he shouldn't come to her at all. He looked at her and said that he wanted to ask her something. The young lady looked at her brother in surprise. He looked at her and asked if she could really endure all this, since they said that the Empress was Princess Godroof. The young lady looked at her brother in surprise and asked what this meant. The young man said that His Majesty, of course, pretends that he will die without her, but he did not make her the Empress. He looked at her and said that the Empress would try to strengthen her position. He said that she would not let Diana, the Emperor's favorite, escape. He looked at his sister and said that there were rumors that the princess was insanely beautiful. The young man looked at his sister and said that for this reason, he had told her earlier to get pregnant before the Emperor got married. Diana looked at her brother with fury and asked if he seriously thought it was that easy. The young man was a little puzzled and surprised, since his sister had a difficult character. Diana sighed heavily and told her brother that the Empress would not be able to get anything from His Majesty. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she meant. Diana said that His Majesty was terribly offended by the word Empress. He looked at his sister in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Diana said with a smile that she was saying that the reason the Emperor didn't make her Empress was because he loved her. He looked at her and said that this was just nonsense, since she did not know men, and love quickly ends. He said that one day the Emperor would stop loving her. Diana said that she knew it. The young man looked at her in surprise. She said with a grin that love for a living person can quickly cool off. Diana said that she will never cool off towards the dead. Diana said that His Majesty sees her as his mother. Diana said that his mother died prematurely because the previous Empress was prosecuted. She said with a smirk that this was the reason he hated the word Empress so much. She looked at her brother and asked if he still thought that the Emperor would stop loving her after she had told him all this. She said that it was much better to be a subject who had both love and power in her hands than an Empress who had only status. The next day, after Adele arrived at the palace, people began to come there to greet her. Of course, they wanted the Empress to have a good impression of them as a person who would lead the state in the future. However, soon after that, as the line of those wishing to greet the Empress ended, even with the onset of night, no news came from the Emperor. The princess looked at us maids and said that she was very tired and wanted to take a warm bath and rest from this crazy day. The princess told the maids that if anyone came, they should send everyone back and say that she would receive them tomorrow. As she left the bathroom, the princess thought about the current situation. A moment later, she saw a young lady standing in front of her. The princess was surprised as she did not know who she was. The princess was confused and did not know who was standing in front of her. She was now in her chambers, and the guests were escorted into the living room and were waiting for the host. For them, this was a general rule of etiquette. But still, the princess looked intently at the girl and wondered who she was. She knew that she, in turn, was not the owner of the bedroom, and so brazenly waited for her here. The young lady greeted the princess with a smile and said that her name was Diana of Poitiers. The princess realized that the emperor's concubine was now in front of her. The princess said that her clothes were all wet and she needed to hurry and dry her hair. Diana looked at the princess in surprise. Diana was wary. The maid looked at the princess and said that she understood everything and would do everything immediately. Diana, in turn, felt relieved since her appearance was not to the emperor's taste. The princess glanced sideways at the concubine and noticed that she was smiling. Diana approached the princess and asked her permission to dry her hair. Adelaide looked at the concubine in surprise and asked if she was really a servant. Diana said that she was not. The princess asked why, then she was offering to dry her hair. Adelaide looked at Diana and asked what she had forgotten in her bedroom, if she was not a servant without her consent. Diana smiled and apologized to the princess if she was offended, but she wanted to tell her something. Adelaide, in turn, looked at the concubine in surprise and asked why she had come here. Diana smiled and said that she wanted to talk to her about His Majesty's preferences. Adelaide was shocked by this statement, as she did not expect the concubine to come to her. Diana said with a smile that she'd come to her because she thought that she might be interested in His Majesty's preferences. Diana said that the emperor liked wavy hair, but since hers was straight, she suggested curling it to achieve waves. Diana said with a smirk that the princess was very pale. She looked at the princess and asked how about some cosmetics to make her cheeks rosy. Adelaide was furious. She did not understand how a simple concubine dared to talk to her. Like that, she grabbed Diana by the hair. Adelaide was furious. She looked at Diana and asked about how their preferences she was now talking about. Adelaide let her go and, turning around, ordered the maid to bring her a glass of wine. Adelaide said she heard Imant was famous for his homemade wine. She said she would have a glass of wine and go to bed. Adelaide looked at Diana and asked why she was giving her advice that she hadn't even asked for, and then being overly frank. Diana said she thought the princess needed to know the emperor's tastes. Adelaide looked at her intently and said that she saw that Diana was one of those people who enjoyed telling another person the whims of another. Diana, in turn, silently bowed her head and did not respond to this. The princess looked at Diana and told her that, in that case, she should go to the emperor and tell him about her tastes. Adelaide said she likes men who can discuss personal issues in person. Adelaide said that she had never in her life betrayed her interests to please another person, so Diana should not share the emperor's preferences with her. Adelaide smirked and told Diana to keep his ideals for herself. Diana froze in bewilderment. She did not expect this from the princess. Adelaide looked at Diana intently and said she could go. Diana looked at Adelaide and said that she thought she had made a mistake, as she had been very nervous before their meeting. She asked for forgiveness. Adelaide looked at her and said that she didn't need to apologize. Diana said with a smile that she hoped Adelaide would have a good rest. Diana told Adelaide not to be shy and to call her if she was not happy with something. Diana looked at the princess with a grin and said that she had instructed the servants not to make mistakes so as not to burden the princess. Diana said that she had to take her leave. Adelaide froze in place at the concubine's words. She wondered if this was not what a master was supposed to say to his guests. Adelaide was shocked as she was greeted upon arrival by the emperor's concubine. She thought it was just absurd. Adelaide was furious and very angry with the emperor as he treated her inappropriately. All this time, the emperor never looked for a prospective bride. This rumor spread throughout the palace in the blink of an eye. Looking at the dress that the nation had given her for repair, she wondered if the emperor really put Diana in charge of all palace preparations. Adelaide realized that for this reason she was a stumbling block between them. The maid came up to the princess and called her, as she had brought her a crown, and wanted to show it to her before the ceremony. The maid presented the princess with a platinum crown, which she will wear at the ceremony. The maid looked at the princess and asked if she would like to try it on. A moment later, the princess tried on the platinum crown. The maid looked at the princess and asked if she didn't like the crown. Adelaide looked at her reflection and asked the maid if they had a golden crown. Adelaide said that a golden crown would suit her better than a silver-plated one. Adelaide said that she still had time before the ceremony itself, so she would like to change the crown. She told the maid to go and bring her the golden one. Diana was preparing the emperor for the ceremony, and her hands were shaking. The emperor, in turn, looked at her intently and called out. Diana looked at the emperor with tears in her eyes. Coming closer to him, she asked for forgiveness. She said that she was very ashamed of her behavior in the emperor's memories. Someone small and fragile appeared to him. He knew that she was the one who forced him to protect her from the title of Empress, and at the same time, she was the one who forced him to turn away. Looking at the tearful concubine, the emperor saw his mother. Every time he heard the word Empress, he felt sick. Diana looked at the emperor and said that Her Highness was very noble and beautiful. Diana said that compared to her, it was no wonder that she had taken her for one of the maids. The emperor's own mother was also the empress's servant. He won't be able to help, but he will be hurt. The emperor looked at Diana in surprise and asked if she had not said earlier that everything had gone well on the day of her greeting. Diana cried and said that everything was fine. Diana came closer to the emperor and said that she was a little upset when she did not find the strength to answer who she really was. Diana said she was content to just be on his side, but it seemed like she was becoming selfish. After these words, she felt sick and lost consciousness for a moment. The emperor was in shock. He shook her and screamed. He shouted for her to breathe deeply, and the emperor, in turn, shouted and called for someone outside. The emperor shouted and called for the servants, and he also shouted at them to bring a doctor as quickly as possible. Diana, in turn, looked at the emperor with tears in her eyes and said that he could not leave her. She begged him not to leave her. A moment later, she fell to the ground, unconscious. The guests at the wedding ceremony were whispering among themselves, as the emperor was very late for the ceremony without any good reason. They were surprised and were told that it did not matter what was happening, since it was the emperor's own ceremony. They thought that maybe the concubine had prevented him from arriving on time, but still the guests felt sorry for the bride who stood alone. The princess was furious because she realized that the emperor simply wanted to make her look stupid. Adelaide remembered Nanny telling her to remember that in that place, you couldn't trust anyone except yourself. The nanny asked Adelaide not to forget that she and only she was capable of defending her honor and dignity. Adelaide told herself that she had to pull herself together right now. Adelaide turned around and saw a servant told him to bring her a chair, and she would sit until His Majesty appeared. She realized that all the aristocrats present were sitting. She wondered why she had to wait. Standing, they were whispering and wondering what the future Empress would do. A moment later, they saw that the servants had not made the chair for the Empress. Everyone was surprised and amazed. Everyone froze in bewilderment, as this was the first time. They were shocked that the bride waiting for His Majesty would greet him sitting down. But Adelaide, in turn, watched everyone closely and smiled. There was an oppressive silence in the hall, where the wedding ceremony was to take place. The man quietly whispered to his brother that the princess's aura was simply amazing. She turned the situation to her advantage with her ease. Lionel looked intently at the future Empress. Adelaide, in turn, looked at the man in surprise. As their gazes crossed, everyone was whispering and admiring the princess. They said that she turned the chair into a throne. In an instant, the Duchess was surprised and amazed, as she understood that the princess took control of the nobility with just one action. The Duchess stood up and said that they might take the opportunity to greet Her Majesty. The Duchess came closer to the princess and greeted her. She said that her name was Elizabeth Ulrich Grand, and that she was really looking forward to their meeting. The man also greeted the princess and said that it was a great honor for him to meet her. He said that his name was August Ulrich Desfonel. The princess said that despite their polite introductions, she was not quite sure how best to introduce herself. It would be wonderful if the ceremony could begin soon, and she could confidently introduce herself to each of them. The princess looked at them and said with a smile that she was Adelaide, who wanted to hurry up and take the surname Ulrich. The Duchess said of the princess that she already looked like the Empress of this empire. August said that it was perfectly normal to confidently state that she was Ulrich. The local nobility who attended the ceremony supported the future Empress and said that Augustus was right. Adelaide looked at them and asked them to move, as it seemed to her that they would have to wait a little longer for His Majesty. The Duchess and Augustus realized that the princess was simply extraordinary, as she invited them to sit down, thus indicating who was of the highest rank in this palace. The Duchess looked at the princess with a grin. She was interested to see the Emperor's face if he were to witness this scene. A moment later, the servants told everyone to stand up, as His Majesty the Emperor had arrived. The Emperor looked at the princess in surprise, as he did not expect her to sit and wait for him. The princess looked at the servant and told him to remove the chair. The operator in turn looked closely at the princess. To his surprise, she was without a doubt the very embodiment of the Empress. He came closer to her and greeted her. The princess looked closely at the Emperor, for she realized that he had a regal face, and the portrait did not do justice to his beauty. She did not understand why he looked so emotionless. The princess was already very tired of waiting for him. The maid told the princess that she should hold the bouquet. The servant looked at the Emperor and told him to walk to the altar, holding Her Majesty's hand. The Emperor looked at the princess with disdain, and turning around, went first. Adelaide, in turn, froze in surprise, as she did not expect him to do this to her. Everyone present froze in surprise, as they did not expect the Emperor to do something like this. The man looked at the Emperor and Empress in shock. He had not expected this, since the Emperor had not deigned to walk hand in hand with the future Empress to the altar. Adelaide, in turn, was very angry since the Emperor simply ignored her in every possible way. The maid looked at the princess and pulled her own wedding bouquet towards her. Adelaide said that she didn't need it and waved it off. The Emperor told Adelaide to cast aside her pride, not to become discouraged, and to keep walking. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he wanted to say. The Emperor said he heard Adelaide ask Diana if she was a maid. Adelaide said she would ask anyone who entered her room without permission. The Emperor said that Diana was not a servant, so he asked her never to make such a gross mistake again. They stood in silence for a while the priest went through the wedding ceremony. A moment later, the Emperor looked at her with disdain and said that he would not spend their first night with her, so she did not have to wait for him. Adelaide was shocked by the Emperor's statement and looked at him intently. The priest, in turn, continued to conduct the ceremony, despite their conversations. Adelaide understood that the Emperor had just indicated that she was not his wife. She understood that she had passed the point of no return after the ceremony. Diana looked at the maid and asked if the ceremony was over yet. The maid looked at her mistress and said that everything was correct, and the ceremony was already over. Another maid looked at Diana and asked if she should eat right now, since she had been skipping meals lately. Diana, in turn, looked at the maid and gave them an angry look. The maid looked at her friend and asked what she was saying, and also asked if she thought Diana was deliberately letting them through. The maid was taken aback and said that she had not meant it at all. The maid said that she could not eat simply because of anxiety. The maid looked at Diana and said that she was truly very sorry and called her milady. The maid looked at her colleague with anger and asked what she had been taught at all, looked at her colleague with surprise, and said that she did not understand what she was guilty of. Diana went up to the maid and told her to step aside, as she wanted to deal with the maid herself. Diana, in turn, looked angrily at the new maid. The girl froze in surprise, and she was very afraid of her mistress. A moment later, she fell on the coal of laziness and asked her for forgiveness. The girl said that she was just new, so she made a mistake. Diana looked at her and said that she would now explain what the girl said wrong. Diana said that the maid called her mistress. She looked at the girl and asked if in her eyes she was a commoner or an ordinary aristocrat. The girl, in turn, was trembling with fear, as she was afraid that she would be punished now. Diana looked at the maid and said that this was a palace and she was appearing. Diana furiously asked the girl how she dared to call her mistress, and she grabbed the maid by the hair. The maid cried and asked Diana for forgiveness. She said that next time she would not make such a mistake. Diana looked at the maid with contempt and pushed her away. Diana said that she was the mistress of the Ivory Palace, so from now on, she should call her mistress. The maid trembled and cried. She said that she understood everything. Diana sighed heavily and said that there were many crazy people in this palace, and she was already tired. She said that she needed to lie down for a while because she was not feeling well. The maid came closer to her and asked if she should call a doctor. Diana looked at the maid and said that they needed to call a doctor. She looked at her maid and with a smirk told her to remember that she had not gotten out of bed. Adelaide knew that she could not trust anyone here, and even the servants had to be treated with caution. There had been no relationship between Amont and Gautroff for a long time. They were separated by a vast sea, and there was no need to encroach on the lands of others that were so far away, much less send a spy to each other. She knew she lacked information. She remembered the emperor telling her not to expect much from him. She was shocked because he didn't even dwell on the fact that he was late for the ceremony. She was shocked because she understood that even on their wedding day, he went to see a concubine. The emperor looked at the maids and asked if Diana had woken up. The maid bowed and said that Diana had not woken up yet. The emperor looked closely at the concubine, who was sleeping quietly in bed. The emperor, in turn, looked at her and saw his own mother in the girl. A moment later, Diana called him. He looked at the sleeping lady in surprise. Diana opened her eyes, looked and saw that the emperor was in wedding clothes, and wondered if her fainting had caused his wedding to fall through. He looked at her and asked if she was already coming to her senses. She asked if he had come to her after the ceremony. She said that he shouldn't have done, that the emperor told her to stop saying such things. The young lady sighed heavily and asked the emperor for forgiveness. She said that she was nothing but trouble. Diana said that it would be better for him to be near Her Majesty today, since she was probably already tired of waiting for him. Carl said he told Adelaide he wouldn't come to her. He looked at Diana and told her to look after herself better. Diana burst into tears and said that she had chosen the Empress's wedding dress, her crown, her bouquet, and jewelry, and her heart had broken into pieces. She knew she had better stop there. Otherwise, he would get tired of her constant whining. She saw his emotionless gaze again. The emperor said that nothing would change and everything would remain the same. Diana asked how he was going to introduce her to the Empress. Diana said that he now had a wife, and the aristocrats would call her mistress. The emperor asked what she wanted to be called. She understood that the emperor was like a lone wolf that could never be tamed forever. Diana told the emperor to tell the empress that she was his beloved. Diana understood that she could control him like a puppet, using his weakness. Carl looked at her and said that he agreed. The young lady looked at him in surprise, with a smile on her face. A moment later, she asked him to hug her. Diana understood that if she could not become his empress, but she had to make sure that no one got a place next to him. The young ladies discussed the fact that the emperor was the son of a concubine before the wedding ceremony, and also did not come to the first wedding night after the ceremony. They said that the empress had forbidden them to enter her room. One of the ladies said that there was no use in her being an empress, even if she did not reach the level of a concubine. A moment later, they fell silent as they saw the Empress. They looked at the magnificent Empress in surprise, as they did not expect to see her. A moment later, they greeted her. Adelaide simply left without speaking to them. The young ladies whispered to each other, wondering if she had heard them, but they still understood that they had to be careful in the future. Adelaide opened the door to her room with fury. She was shocked because of course she expected something like this, but it was much harsher than she thought. She came alone, taking no one from home with her, not only because that was the rule, but because she knew that none of them deserved to endure exile with her. She knew she needed to get her bearings and stop thinking about the past and deal with what she had. The maid looked at Diana and asked if there was anything else that needed to be done. Diana, in turn, gave the maids a cold and angry look. They froze in place. She said that nothing more was needed. Because of the monsters that descended from the tower, she lost her parents, but still received the status of the count's daughter and managed to win the love of the emperor. She understood that it was all thanks to her diligence, and that some girl who was born under a lucky star and became a princess had no right to stand above her. Diana knew that today the Empress would not be able to properly enjoy her status. The Empress tried on dresses, but none of them fit her. The maid asked for forgiveness and said that apparently the measurements from Gautroff did not match the ones here. The Empress asked why the wedding dress fit her, and the maid said that it was made by other craftsmen. The Empress looked at the maids and said that nothing could be done about it. She looked at them and told them to go and fix everything, and she might be late for the banquet. No big deal. The maids hesitated looking at the Empress. Adelaide, in turn, looked at them in surprise and asked what happened. Asked for forgiveness and said that it is very difficult to adjust clothes of a smaller size. Adelaide froze in place as she thought about what to do now. Madame looked at her daughter and said that she was constantly destroying towers and monsters, and the battle inside the palace seemed insignificant to her. She said that you, in turn, never rested from this war. Madame looked at her daughter and said that she was warning her as she should not relax for a minute in the palace. The Empress looked at the maids and said that they had only two options. Either she would appear at the banquet in her wedding dress, or she would wear a dress of the wrong size. She looked at the maids and asked if Diana had really prepared the dress for her wedding. She asked the maids if he had any objections. The emperor and the maids, in turn, did not answer the questions asked. Adelaide knew it was very funny because Diana wanted to show her inaccessibility with these dresses and the emperor's love. She looked at the maids and told them to bring her wedding dress and her crown. Adelaide was angry and knew they were underestimating her. Diana assumed that the Empress would hardly appear at the banquet, since she would not wear the clothes she brought from the Empire, and all the dresses that had been prepared were too small for her. All the guests praised Diana for the banquet she had prepared. Diana said with a smile that the Count had helped her a lot. August smiled and said that it was all thanks to her refined taste. The young ladies were delighted with her new necklace and the earrings that came with it. Diana looked at everyone intently, but did not answer. One of the ladies said that she wanted to look at something for herself, but found out that Diana had bought everything, so she had to go back. One lady told Diana with a grin that everyone was saying that the emperor spent his wedding night with her. The young ladies looked at her with smiles and said that they had a simply fantastic love, and they envied her. Diana smiled and said that she would refrain from making any statements, since she felt very sorry for the Empress. Diana understood that all these aristocrats, who were born with a golden spoon in their mouth, were standing and trying to somehow get closer to her. Diana said that she told the Emperor many times to come to her. She said that she was afraid the Empress would misunderstand her. She saw that they were giving her compliments, trying to maintain eye contact with her, and smiling. One lady looked at Diana and said that the harvest from their territory had become much smaller. She asked if it was possible to reduce taxes. Another lady turned to Diana and said that a tower had recently appeared near their territory. She asked Diana if she could send a couple of strikers. A moment later, Diana's brother approached her and said with a smile that their hostess was very modest. The young man said that by order of the emperor, all matters concerning the palace were under the control of the mistress, and the range of these rights was obviously much broader than that of the empress. Lionel came closer to them and said that their statements could be considered treason. The young people froze in surprise. Lionel, in turn, stared at them intently. The boy looked at Lionel and asked what the problem was, and also asked if he was wrong. Diana looked at them and realized that they needed to be stopped immediately, since in such a place, a conflict with Lionel could only worsen the situation. Lionel looked at them with contempt and asked if they really needed to be reminded again why they were having a banquet today. Lionel looked at the boy and said that if he was even a little worried about himself, he better watch his words. He was in shock. Lionel, in turn, turned around and began to leave. The young man was angry to the depths of his soul, but Diana stopped him, as she did not want her brother to cause a scandal. A moment later, the servants announced that the Empress had arrived. Everyone stood frozen in bewilderment, looking at the Empress. The Empress, in turn, walked slowly towards the throne. All the aristocrats did not take their eyes off her. Diana was amazed because the Empress was wearing a wedding dress. The Empress turned around and said with a smile that she was a little late. The imperial staircase, which no one had the right to climb, Adelaide walked up it with confidence. All the aristocrats looked intently at the Empress. Adelaide was alarmed and did not like this atmosphere. Adelaide looked at the Count and asked if he was pleased with the banquet. The Count smiled and said that the Empress had finally arrived and he had been waiting for her all evening. Adelaide looked at the Count in surprise, as she did not expect him to say something like that. The aristocrats were alarmed. They did not know what to do because they understood that they had to say hello, but they did not dare to approach her. A moment later, Lionel approached the Empress first. The Empress looked at Lionel intently, and a moment later some of the aristocrats greeted the Empress and said that they were very glad to see her. The Empress smiled and said that she was glad to meet them, and also asked if they were all from the Duchy of Valdora. The other aristocrats understood that this would not do, and they also had to greet the Empress. Diana, in turn, looked intently at the Empress because she understood that she did not even look at her. Diana, gritting her teeth, said that if the Empress did not want to look at her, then she would make it so that the Empress would only look at her. Diana stepped forward, and the Empress looked at her. All the aristocrats whispered they did not understand how she could appear before the Empress in such a place. They said that surely this confidence came from the fact that the Emperor himself was standing behind her. Diana heard the aristocrats say that this was a very interesting and unexpected turn of events. Diana looked closely at the Empress and greeted her and introduced herself. Adelaide said with a smile that she was glad to see them. Adelaide understood that Diana simply decided to put on a fun show for the aristocrats present. Diana looked at the Empress and said with a grin that she had organized their wedding and this banquet. She asked the Empress if she liked the banquet. The aristocrats instantly fell silent and froze in shock. They looked at the Empress, whose expression instantly changed. Adelaide looked at Diana and said that she had done a great job, and told Diana not to be upset that she couldn't wear the dresses that Diana had prepared for her. Adelaide said they were beautiful, but unfortunately, the size was not right for her. Adelaide smirked and told Diana that there was no need to apologize as everyone can make mistakes. Diana froze in surprise and looked at the Empress with a gray expression. Diana heard the aristocrats whispering from afar. They said that the Empress was wearing a wedding dress, but because it did not look like a bride's dress, and they did not even understand this. The aristocrats said that if Madame Diana prepared the clothes, then she did not do the dresses for the banquet on purpose. The Empress looked intently at Diana, who in turn did not even raise her eyes. A moment later, the servants announced that the Emperor had arrived to see His Majesty. The aristocrats were shocked, as the Emperor came at a very interesting moment, and they hoped that the situation would not escalate. The Emperor walked slowly towards the Empress. He noticed that even today, all eyes were on the Empress, but she calmly dominated and ruled. It seemed to him that even if he pricked her, not a drop of blood would flow. Walking toward the Empress, the Emperor noticed that Diana was crying. He came closer to her and looked at her in surprise. Diana, in turn, looked at the emperor with tears in her eyes and called him. The emperor glared at the empress. Adelaide was shocked, as she knew Diana was just putting on an act. Adelaide wondered if the emperor thought she had deliberately made Diana cry. The emperor looked at the empress with anger and asked what she was doing now. Adelaide looked at the emperor as she wanted to ask him now what he was doing. The empress looked at her husband and said that she had simply greeted Diana. The emperor looked at her with fury and asked how she could greet him in such a way that Diana was now crying. The empress looked at them and said that she was also very interested in why Diana was now shedding tears in front of them. She told the emperor to ask her personally. Diana looked at the emperor and said that she just wanted to greet the empress. The emperor looked at Diana intently, but said nothing. A moment later, he slowly walked up to the throne. A moment later, the emperor told the empress to stop touching Diana. The emperor said that Diana was his beloved, so the empress had better leave her alone. The emperor looked at the empress and said that he would not worry about her beloved. He looked at her and asked if they had agreed. Adelaide did not know whether this was a good quality, but when she first began to smile at the golden one, the empress told the emperor to convey these words to his beloved. The empress said, looking at Diana, that she had met her twice, and each time she came to her herself. The operator looked intently at his wife, but did not answer. The man looked intently at the empress and said that she did not even lose her calm and composure at such a moment. Lionel looked closely at the empress and agreed with the man. He understood that she was not exactly remaining unperturbed, but rather simply trying to calm herself down. Adelaide was furious. She remembered the dress that didn't fit her and all the hidden smirks that looked at her with disdain. Adelaide knew that due to the emotions that had flared up, her mana had grown too much. She understood that it was still too early to release it. The empress, in turn, decided to cast aside all thoughts of Diana. She wondered what was wrong with the emperor, and why he couldn't live without his beloved, and also why he didn't make her empress. She was furious because he had brought her here, and was now showing her his character. She wondered if he had a fetish for fake love. She wondered what kind of nonsense he was saying, that he wouldn't worry about her lover. She remembered how I told her to present herself as if she had everything, and she didn't need to act modest, because when you have nothing, people will immediately understand it. She understood that if she revealed that she had become empress only in words, and that the emperor did not recognize her, that same day they would tear her to pieces. She understood that she needed to come up with something, and quickly. The empress looked at the maids and asked who was in charge of important palace affairs. The maid looked at the empress and said that while this position was vacant, the empress was surprised. She said that then there should be a temporary replacement person. Adelaide looked at the maids and asked if Diana was in charge of everything. The maid looked away and said that it was so. The empress looked at the maid and asked who had done this before her. The maid said that it had been Jean Giggs, the count's wife. Adelaide looked at the maid and told her to call the countess at once, as she wanted to meet her immediately. And Adelaide also told the maid to bring her the latest edition of the Empire's Code of Laws. Adelaide understood that the current emperor had entrusted the management of the palace to Diana instead of the empress, but she knew that with her appointment to this title, she had received exclusive rights. Sometime later, the maid came to the empress and said that a guest had come to see her. The duchess entered the room and greeted the empress. The duchess smiled and said that they had met her during the banquet, and the empress said with a smile that she was very glad to see her and that she also wanted to meet her. The duchess looked at the empress and asked if they could speak to her alone. The empress looked at the maid and told her to go out for a while, and the maid obediently obeyed. The duchess, in turn, looked closely at the empress. She was shorter than she had imagined, but she did not have the feeling that the empress was weak. Elizabeth saw that there was a dominant aura hovering around the current empress. The duchess looked at the empress and said that she liked the empress very much. Adelaide looked at the duchess in surprise, as she did not expect to hear something like that. The Duchess told the Empress that she had heard that she had called Hannah Giggs. The Countess said that she had been her nurse. Adelaide looked at Elizabeth in surprise and asked why she had spoken to her on this subject. Elizabeth sighed heavily and said that the fact that she had called her meant that the Empress wanted to strengthen her position in the palace. The Empress looked at the Duchess in surprise and asked if it was not obvious, said that the Empress was right and she should do so. The Duchess said that it would be difficult to do so, since Diana had the advantage of being the Emperor's love. The Duchess said that the Duke was behind them, and all the people in the palace were their people. The Empress looked at Elizabeth in surprise and asked if the Duchess would be influenced by the fact that she wanted to take over the management of the palace. The Duchess was shocked, as the Empress turned out to be a straightforward person, and she should not beat around the bush. Elizabeth said that the Emperor was under the control of Diana and the Duke. Because of this, he could not follow the true imperial path. The Duchess said that for this reason she wanted the Empress to cut the ropes with which Charles was controlled. The Empress asked if she could do this if she took control of the management of the palace. Elizabeth said that this was so. The Duchess said that Hannah would be a great help to her. The Duchess said that she would give her one more piece of advice. She told the Empress to put out an announcement that she was looking for an assistant. The Empress looked at her in surprise. Elizabeth said that the management of the palace and its internal affairs was most often handled by a woman. It would be nice if her advisor were a man. The Duchess said that every time her father changed concubines, her mother would get herself assistants. The Empress asked with a smile, really? In other words, she means to say that since the Emperor has a lover, she must also have a lover. The Duchess sighed heavily and said that they said that the Empress should raise the temperature out of spite. But in their empire, it was very important not to lose face. Elizabeth said that if the Empress did nothing after such insults, then everyone would look down on her and whisper that she was worse than any mistress, so she should not retreat. The Duchess said that the probability was, of course, small, but if the Duchy of Valdor sent her an application, then she should without hesitation agree to their candidacy. Hannah Giggs came to meet the Empress. She had a relationship with the previous Empress. Therefore, she was engaged in palace affairs and was the nanny of the Grand Duchess. For a long time, the Cane held this position in the palace, but her normal life began to collapse with the arrival of one person, namely Diana Poitiers. She was the cause of misfortune and death of the previous Empress, a girl who was remarkably similar to the biological mother of Emperor Charles. Soon, Karl fell in love with her. Some time later, all the palace affairs he entrusted her. First of all, having received power, Diana expelled Hannah from the palace. The elderly lady who was dismissed in disgrace now stands before the new Empress with an inexplicable feeling of excitement. The Empress, in turn, looked intently at the elderly lady. She asked the Empress for forgiveness, since she had not been here for a long time, and tears welled up on their own. Adelaide looked at Hannah with a smile and said that the palace was probably the same as it was during the Empress's life. Hannah said that she remembered this sofa, as well as the day she chose it. Hannah sighed heavily and said she thought it would be a good idea to change it. Adelaide looked at her and said that she would like to trust her with this matter. Adelaide asked Hannah if she agreed with this. Hannah looked at the Empress and said that she would be glad to, but she thought His Majesty would not like it. The Empress looked at Hannah and asked if she agreed. Hannah smiled and said that, as she had already said, she would gratefully accept her offer. A moment later, a maid entered the Empress's office and said that the dress she had recently ordered had arrived. The Empress looked at the maid in surprise and asked what the problem was. The maid hesitated and did not know how to answer the question posed. Hannah looked at the maid intently and asked why she was hesitating. Hannah told her to tell it like it is. The maid looked at the Empress and said that the palace financial department said that they could not pay for the Empress's dress. The Empress froze in bewilderment. She was shocked by such a statement. The Empress thought it was just nonsense. and she could not understand how they could not strengthen her dress. The Empress looked at Hannah and asked if she should call the merchants and pay for everything personally. Hannah sighed heavily and said that it would be better that way, since unnecessary rumors would only harm her, and she needed to thank the merchants properly so that they would keep everything a secret. Hannah looked at the Empress and said that she should not meet them personally and asked her to entrust this matter to her. The Empress looked at the maid and told her to bring the merchants to them immediately. The Empress walked slowly into the room where she kept her savings. She was a little puzzled, as she didn't know she would need them so soon. She was furious, as she realized that they had decided to challenge her, but she took it with her head held high. Hannah said she would look at the quality of the dress and pay for everything. Hannah asked if she could use the entire amount without returning the remainder. She said she hoped her honor would not be tarnished by this event. The Empress said that this was why she had brought the ingot, and it was at her disposal. The Empress looked at Hannah and asked her how she thought this could happen. Hannah sighed heavily and said she thought there was no budget for her palace. The Empress looked at her in surprise and asked how it could be that they had allocated a budget. Hannah said that in their empire, the budget for the next year is allocated at the end of the previous one. Since the Empress appeared only recently, her palace was probably not taken into account. The Empress looked at Hannah in surprise and asked if this was really how it was supposed to happen. Hannah said that of course not, and that funds could be distributed through an additional system for such unforeseen situations, but only His Majesty the Emperor had control over this budget. The Empress thought for a moment. She realized that she would have to meet the Emperor in person. A moment later, a maid came to the Empress and said that she had brought a merchant. The Empress looked at the maid and told her to put the merchant down. Adelaide looked at Hannah and said that she had great hopes for her. Hannah smiled and told the Empress not to worry. Hannah, in turn, looked intently at the Empress and asked where she was going. Adelaide smiled and said that she needed to know the enemy. By sight, the Empress told Hannah not to worry about her, and they would meet later. Adelaide asked the Kana to stay in her palace today. The servants looked at the Empress and said they were glad to welcome her. The Empress said it looked like a central meeting was taking place. The servant looked at the Empress and said that was indeed the case. The Empress said that she was asking for an audience with the Emperor. The servant looked at the Empress and said that if she would wait in the drawing room, he would find out from the Emperor and inform her. The Empress looked at the servant and said that there was no need for that, and asked him to take her to the meeting waiting room, and she would wait there. She wanted to see how the meetings were going. The man asked the Emperor to send them strikers who could destroy the tower and keepers who could protect them from the monsters. The man said that people were dying there right now, and flying monsters had already started coming out of there, and they couldn't stop them. The man said angrily that they needed magicians. August thought for a moment, since the man asked to send them help, small that the man simply did not have enough brains to analyze the situation correctly. Count Pointier looked at Count Kelvin and asked if he was exaggerating his problem, since their tower was only on the 4th level. The Count was puzzled and said that he was not exaggerating. He said that the portal was growing rapidly. The Count asked if such monsters had appeared. How could it stop at the same level? Count Pointier said that let's say they send magicians into their territory, but what would happen if at that time the 1st level tower descended on the Emperor's palace? He asked if he really wanted to put the Emperor's safety at risk. He said that these were just selfish requests. The Count looked at Lennox in surprise and asked what he had just said about selfish requests. Lennox asked angrily if he was wrong in this situation. The Empress sat in the waiting room and heard everything. She was surprised that the tower had come down. Lionel looked at the Emperor and called him. Lionel said that he believed that help should be sent to the Count's domain urgently, since they had enough people and the imperial magicians were in the palace. Lennox looked at the Minister of Defense with fury and asked what he was saying. Now Lennox said that one would think that their magicians were fooling around in the palace. The emperor shouted angrily for them to stop, as there was no end to this. The emperor looked at the count and said that he was very sorry that this had happened to their land, and he would consider their request. The count looked at the emperor with tears in his eyes and asked him to understand him. The emperor sighed heavily and said that with this they had finished their meeting and everyone could go free. The count was in shock as he understood that everything was over and everything had come to an end. The servant approached the emperor and said that Her Majesty the Empress was waiting for him. The emperor looked at the servant in surprise, as he did not expect the empress to come to him. The servant said that she was waiting in the waiting room and asked the emperor where the empress should be escorted. The operator said that there was no need to escort the empress anywhere. As soon as the conference room was free, she could be invited into the room. Everyone who came out of the assembly hall greeted the empress who taught him. The empress was surprised, as she realized that in the end, the emperor decided not to send the magicians and wanted to meet the count personally. A moment later, the duke came out of the assembly room and said with a smile that he was very glad to see his daughter-in-law here. Everyone froze in surprise as he called the empress daughter-in-law. The empress looked at the man intently, but did not answer. The duke looked at the empress and said that if this had offended her, then he apologized, and as the emperor's eldest uncle, he wanted to show friendliness. The empress looked at him and said with a smile on her face that she thought there were other ways to show his goodwill. She said that he should be more careful in the future. He looked at her intently and said he would keep that in mind. A moment later, the empress's gaze met Lionel's. Lionel, in turn, took this into account and greeted the empress according to all the rules of etiquette. Adelaide looked at Lionel and said with a smile that she was very glad to see him. The empress looked intently at Lionel and said that she had just wanted to ask who Count Kelvin was. A moment later, the count approached her and greeted the empress. She looked at him and asked if he said that flying monsters had appeared in his territory. The count, in turn, looked at the empress in surprise, and a moment later said that this was indeed the case. The empress asked if there were no magicians who were responsible for these lands. Lennox intervened in their conversation and told the empress that they were being assigned to the palace. The empress looked at the young man in surprise. He smiled and said that he was glad to meet them, and also introduced himself. He said that his name was Lennox Poitiers, vice captain of the magicians. The empress said that they now have flying monsters on their territory, and in Amont, their tower was assigned to the middle class. The empress said that from the conversation she understood that they would not receive help. Adelaide said that she was not eavesdropping. It was just too loud. Everyone froze in surprise, looking at the empress. Lennox looked at the empress and said with a smile that she was probably very worried, but that this should not be done since he would protect the palace and not a single monster would penetrate the palace grounds. He understood that she was pretending to know everything, although in fact she did not even think about it. The empress was a little puzzled, as she knew he was simply underestimating her. A moment later, a servant told the empress that she could go inside, as the emperor was already waiting for her. The empress said that she understood and was already on her way turning around. She said that she was glad to meet everyone. Cold look, reserved behavior, even in these minor things. It is clear that she is from the upper class. Lionel, in turn, stared intently after the empress. He could not take his eyes off her, as he remembered the first day of their meeting. The emperor looked closely at Imperial and asked what she wanted to talk to him about. Adelaide looked at him sideways and asked why he decided to marry her. The emperor looked at her in surprise and asked what she meant. The empress looked at him and asked why he decided that she was suitable for the position of Empress. Adelaide said that it was he who sent her a proposal of marriage. The emperor looked at her and told her to just forget. He looked at her and said that her existence was like these feathers. Her presence alone was enough. She was a little puzzled by this answer, since she was just there as pens on a pen, and not even a rod. She looked at him and asked if he really meant to say that she should sit and just exist with the title of Empress. Adelaide looked at the emperor and asked why he was ruining her reputation. The emperor said that he did not do that. Adelaide asked if he was afraid that she could harm Diana. The emperor did not answer the question, but the empress had enough, and this, she understood, the reason why he accepted her. As Empress Adelaide said that she was glad that he wanted her to take the role of empress. She said that their thoughts converged on this. The empress looked at the emperor intently and said that she would fulfill all her obligations. She said for this reason she hoped that he as emperor would assist her in this. He looked at her in surprise and asked what kind of help she expected from him. The empress said that first she needed an assistant, someone with whom she could decide matters of the empire. She said that it would be good to consult with the manager, but unfortunately, it turned out to be Diana. Adelaide looked at the emperor and said with a grin that she couldn't call her to her for a meeting. The emperor looked intently at the empress, but didn't answer. The empress said that for this reason she would like to choose Hannah for this role. The emperor looked at her in surprise, as he was very surprised that she decided to choose her. The empress said that she had previously heard that he had thrown her out of the palace, so she was asking him to bring Hannah back. The empress said that she was not going to reinstate her in her managerial position. The emperor looked at her and said that he completely agreed with her decision. The empress looked intently at the emperor and thanked him. A moment later, Adelaide said that the empress's palace had not been taken into account in the budget allocation. Adelaide said she hoped he would put in place a system of additional funding. The emperor saw her red dress, which represented the power of the empress. He always extended his hand, but could never touch the hem of her dress. His mother said that the empress would never recognize him. His mother comforted him and pitied him, and these memories made the emperor feel pain. The emperor thought for a moment that the budget for the empress's palace had not been allocated. The emperor called the servant and told him to call Diana. Sometime later, Diana came to the emperor and greeted him with a smile on her face. She looked at the emperor and asked if he had summoned her. The emperor looked at her sideways and asked if she had brought papers related to the palace budget. Diana came closer to him and said with a smile that, of course, she had brought everything and put the documents on his desk. The emperor looked at her and asked why funds had not been allocated for the empress's palace. The emperor said that it should have been included at her coronation. Diana looked at the emperor in shock, as she was surprised. A moment later, she asked the emperor for forgiveness and said that she had completely forgotten about it. She said that she thought she had already completed this task. She asked him for forgiveness several times. The emperor looked at her with a cold gaze, told her to stop. He said that she could do it now. The emperor looked at her and told her to stop crying because at the slightest thing she immediately started bawling. Diana, with tears in her eyes, said that the empress must have been very angry. She said that she was very sorry and asked the emperor what she should do now. The emperor looked at Diana and saw his mother in her. She also looked at her son and, with tears in her eyes, asked what they should do. Diana looked at the emperor intently. She asked what he wanted to talk to her about. She was a little worried, as she had a bad feeling. The emperor looked at her and said that the empress's power had been transferred to Her Highness, and all the internal affairs that he had previously entrusted to her would now be decided by the empress. She was shocked as the emperor's words took her by surprise. The man looked at his brother and said that the duke wanted to put a puppet in the empress's place, and for this purpose he found a princess from a distant empire. He smiled and said that the duke clearly had not calculated all the moves. Lionel said that it was exactly like that, and with just one look, the empress changed the whole atmosphere around her. He smiled and said that now he understood why the empress sent her daughter to the ends of the earth. He said that he, the new Emperor Gotroff, was only 14 years old, and if such a powerful sister was next to him, it would hinder him quite a lot. He looked at his brother and asked if he was listening, but Lionel did not answer, as he was thinking about the empress. From the first day of their meeting, she never left his mind for a second. Hannah looked at the Empress and said with a smile that she had done a great job. Adelaide looked at her and asked if she had paid for the dress. Hannah hesitated and said that she had paid. Adelaide looked at her in surprise and asked what the problem was. Hannah looked closely at the Empress and asked if she had personally chosen the dress she was now wearing. Adelaide said the maids asked her if she wanted to wear it today, and she agreed. Hannah sighed heavily and told the Empress that she would then order a new outfit for her. The Empress looked at her in surprise and asked why was there really something in its tailoring that was not in keeping with the empire. Hannah sighed heavily and said that it was not that simple. She looked like the previous Empress, as if she was wearing her predecessor's clothes. Hannah said that this would greatly provoke the emperor. For this reason it was undesirable to wear such dresses. Hannah was close to the previous Empress, and later the Charlemagne kicked her out. Although it was strange, Adelaide knew that in such matters it was better to follow her advice. She looked at Hannah and agreed with her. Adelaide understood that she had no one else to trust in this palace. The Empress said that she still had to meet with Count Kelvin. Adelaide told her to invite him to the palace. Diana sat in her room and cried she was shocked that the emperor had so easily deprived her of all power. Diana wondered what Adelaide had done, that the emperor had given power into her hands. Diana knew that Adelaide had just been lucky from birth. She had everything. Diana knew that Adelaide had everything without any effort. Diana knew that it was simply unfair to her. Diana stared out the window and thought about the situation. The Ivory Palace, the palace where the emperor's mother wanted to live. She knew that the emperor had given her the palace. She said with fury that he would not allow her to be deprived of these possessions. I wanted to give neither my lover nor this palace to anyone. She remembered that the emperor had told her that an additional budget needed to be allocated urgently, and that this would be her last task. Diana looked at the maid and called her. Diana told the maid to bring her the documents about the financial affairs of the imperial palace, as some changes needed to be made. Diana wanted to make Adelaide understand that she was just a shell with the status of Empress. The Count sat and waited for the Empress to arrive. Some time later, the Empress entered the room. The Empress, not having time to sit down, asked the Count when the tower appeared. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The Empress asked if flying monsters had appeared over time. She asked the Count what the diameter of the tower was. Adelaide asked the Count if it was getting wider. The Count froze in bewilderment, as he did not expect the Empress to ask something like that. The Count was taken aback, and a moment later he came to his senses. He said that as soon as he saw the flying monsters, he came here. He said that they had neither a striker to destroy the tower nor a defending mage, and the ordinary inhabitants were fighting the creatures as best they could. The Empress looked at the Count in surprise and asked if there really wasn't a single warrior. The Count said that that was exactly the case, and that magicians were being sent from the central region based on the portal's danger level. The Empress looked at the Count in shock and said that the tower was now at the 4th level, and that was above average. She looked at him in surprise and asked if they hadn't sent anyone. The Count said that even the towers with the 2nd level had to wait for several days. The Empress thought for a moment and said that this meant that they were being left to their fate. The Count looked at her and asked for forgiveness. He asked her to save them, as the common people were dying. He said that they were being torn to pieces by giant claws and teeth. Their knights were so weakened that they were dying during the battle. Hannah looked at the Count in surprise and shock and told him to stop telling such cruel things to Her Majesty. The Empress said that everything was fine, and she understood perfectly well how harmlessly the Count had described the hell that was now on their territory. She remembered the flying, ugly creatures that attacked ordinary people. Madame looked at her daughter and asked if she thought she could save everyone and everything. She told Adelaide that she just needed to be patient and close her eyes to all this for the last time. Madame said that then she would throw the world at her feet. Adelaide looked at her mother and said that she said so. only because she had not seen the torment that people went through. Adelaide looked at her mother and said that she didn't need the whole world. She looked at her daughter with a sharp gaze, but did not answer. Adelaide knew that this was the day when the rift began in her relationship with her mother, and subsequently, she took away her title of crown princess. The Count looked at the Empress and thanked her for her concern. He said that he needed to return to his native land as soon as possible. Adelaide looked at him and told him to evacuate all the inhabitants to the nearest safe place. The Count looked at her in surprise. The Empress said that the best shelter from the flying monsters is a dungeon or caves. Adelaide told the Count to take all the children of the elderly and wounded to such places, and to try to negotiate with other counties. She said that this would make him last longer, as it could provide additional resistance to the central government. The Empress glanced sideways at Hannah. A moment later, Hannah walked up to the Count and presented him with a bag of gold. The Count looked at the Empress in surprise and asked why she was doing this. The Empress looked at the Count intently and said that this should be enough to come to an agreement with the neighbors. She asked him for forgiveness and said that she could not help in any other way. Lionel looked at his brother and asked him why he thought the Empress had called the Count. He sighed heavily and said that he did not think the Emperor would refuse to help the Count, as he was devoted to the imperial family. Lionel looked at his brother and asked if he was trying to understand why the ruler abandoned his charges in trouble. He told his brother that he was ridiculous. The man looked out the window and said that the Count had arrived to see them. The young brothers looked at the Count intently, for he had no face. Lionel came closer to the Count and asked him in bewilderment what had happened, since he saw that he was crying. He asked the Count if something had really happened to him in the Empress's palace. The Count looked at Lionel and said that the Empress had given him gold bars. The Count said that the Empress had said to evacuate all residents immediately. The Count looked at the young brothers and said that he was sincerely grateful to them very much, but he needed to return quickly and help his people. The Duke looked at the Count and told him to wait and take something from them as well, and he also asked the Count for forgiveness that they could not personally help them. With tears in his eyes, he asked them to stop, as he was very ashamed of himself. The young people were surprised, but they were even more surprised by the Empress herself. Lionel was surprised by the Empress's action. He wondered if she had really allocated gold so that the Count could save his inhabitants. The Empress looked at Hannah and said that the only thing she could do in this situation was to give him a few bars of gold. Hannah looked at the Empress and said that she had done all she could. The Empress thought for a moment, for she knew she could have done more. She remembered her mother, how she had told her that she was very smart. But the world was arranged so that the smart create and the wise seize. For this reason, one must act wisely. Adelaide knew that she was suffering humiliation, and shame could only give a little money to someone who desperately needed help. And all this because she had no power. She knew that the only way to get it in a foreign country was to think ahead. Hannah looked at the Empress and asked if she should ask for an audience with the Emperor. Hannah asked if they should establish contact with His Majesty, since they were in Amont. The Empress thought about having a good relationship with the Emperor. Hannah looked at the Empress with a keen gaze and said with a smile that she was beautiful. The Empress looked in the mirror in surprise. She saw that she looked magnificent. The Empress wondered what wise thing to do to make her life easier in this empire. She knew that first of all, she had to improve her relationship with the Emperor. The servant looked at the Emperor and said that Her Majesty the Empress had arrived. A moment later, the Emperor saw the beautiful Empress, who was gazing at him intently. He saw her golden eyes and red lips, her perfectly white skin, and the graceful lines of her collarbone. He noticed that she looked completely different. Now the Emperor could not take his eyes off her. The Emperor looked at the Empress and asked with a smile what had brought her to him at such a late hour. Adelaide looked at him and asked if he had not yet had dinner. Would he like to share the meal with her? The Emperor looked at the Empress and with a grin said that he was just about to talk to her. A moment later, the emperor asked her why she had summoned the count to her audience. The empress looked at him intently, but said nothing. And the emperor asked her again why she had invited him to her place. A moment later, the empress said that she was interested in what had happened on his land, looked at her, and asked if it was only out of curiosity. The empress looked at the emperor in surprise and asked what he was hinting at. The emperor said that his county was dying because of monsters, but he did not help him, so he just sent him back. The emperor asked her why she invited him again. The emperor looked at her intently and said that he heard that she gave him more gold. The emperor asked her why she was doing this. The empress was shocked as she realized that these rumors had already reached him. The emperor looked at her with contempt and asked if she was really pretending to be noble. The emperor looked at her intently and said that you are different from your husband. The emperor, she is incredibly kind. He asked her if these were really the words she wanted to hear. Adelaide looked at the emperor in surprise and said that she did not understand him. Adelaide said that she had called the count to find out how things were going in his territory and had given him a small sum of money to evacuate his inhabitants. She looked at Carl and asked why he was describing it as if she had committed a crime. Carl, in turn, came closer to her and said that from now on, she needed to close her ears and eyes and think only about good things. Adelaide suddenly remembered her mother, who said that she just needed to be patient and close her eyes to all this for the last time. Adelaide looked at the emperor in surprise and said that it was a humane act that she could not help but do. Carl looked at her with a grin and asked if it really meant that he was not human. The empress was taken aback and asked him if she had really said that. Carl looked at her with disdain and said that it was all very funny, since she suddenly became an empress, and suddenly, unexpectedly, his people became her own. Adelaide was in shock as her hands were shaking. She could no longer be near the emperor. The emperor, in turn, looked at her intently. He saw her fragile bones. He understood that if he pressed them slightly, he would break them. Carl felt a sweet scent coming from her. He wondered if this was the woman who attracted everyone's attention with just one look. Adelaide Vaz, in turn, looked at him angrily. The emperor looked at her with a grin and asked why she had such a face. He asked her if she had come to him in such a guise to seduce him and spend the night with him. The emperor looked at her and said that if she asked him to hug her, he would do it. Carl said that it would be nice to have their wedding night simplified tonight. Adelaide was shocked by such a statement. The emperor grinned and told her to close her eyes, and he would kiss her. She looked at him and furiously told him to stop. The empress pushed the emperor away. With lightning speed, the emperor caught her hand, and for a while they stared at each other. The emperor looked at her and said that he knew that she had once been the crown princess. He looked at her and said that her eyes really befitted the imperial status. He said with a grin that she should not forget that he was the emperor here. Carl said that he liked docile and innocent girls. He told her not to interfere in his affairs in the future. He looked at her and asked if she understood him. The empress looked at the emperor angrily. When leaving, the emperor said that she could go to her room. The empress, in turn, left the emperor and was slowly returning to her place when suddenly she heard someone calling her. Diana looked at the empress in surprise and asked if it was really her. Diana looked at Adelaide and asked what she was doing here. Adelaide was shocked because the one she didn't want to see right now was Diana. Diana looked at the empress and with a grin asked what was wrong with her. Diana said with a grin to the empress that her hands and whole body were shaking. Adelaide was in shock. She wondered what was happening to her face now. Adelaide looked at Diana and told her to move away, all the while smirking and saying that the empress had beautiful makeup on right now. Diana came closer to the empress and quietly said that apparently she followed her advice. Diana, with a contemptuous smirk, said that it seemed that something did not go according to plan. Diana looked at Adelaide and asked if that was the reason she was running away. Now Adelaide looked at Diana in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Diana scornfully told the empress that she should have put on less makeup as she was very pale. Diana gave the Empress a disdainful look and said that she would go to the Emperor. Adelaide, in turn, "You left the Emperor's palace in a hurry." She remembered Diana's words, asking her if this was the reason she was running away. The Empress ran away in a hurry and did not notice how she stumbled, but fortunately, Lionel caught her. The Empress, in turn, looked at Lionel in shock. The young man looked intently at the Empress. He could not take his gaze off her. The Empress looked at Lionel with a puzzled expression and said that she had only made a mistake on the stairs and thanked him in a hurry. A moment later, she said she would go. Lionel looked after her intently. He was surprised since such behavior was unusual for her. He noticed that she was out of sorts, and Lionel, in turn, wondered if she was okay. Lionel remembered their first meeting, when she had smiled brightly at him. He looked at his hand in surprise. Lionel, the hand he had touched on her shoulders. It was still burning, as if he had touched fire. Hannah looked at the Empress and asked why she came back so quickly. She was a little confused about the Empress's condition. After everything that happened, the Empress decided to take a bath. She was puzzled and did not know what to do. She remembered her nanny, and when she said that she needed to act as her heart told her, the nanny told her that she had to do whatever Adelaide thought was right, and whatever the result, it would be a good experience for her. The nanny said that this should be her true path. She said that the world is changed by people like the princess. Adelaide understood that she urgently needed to expand her power independent of the power of the Emperor. Adelaide was shocked because she had always had bad luck. Adelaide remembered that the magician had once told her that she had an eternal companion, and that this was luck that would accompany her more often than her parents. But now the Empress understood that the magician was a complete charlatan. Hannah, in turn, watched the Empress closely. The Empress's expression after meeting the Emperor made her nervous. Hannah knew that after her conversation with Carl, the Empress immediately ran into Diana, who completely disgraced her, and then she slipped on the stairs and was caught by Lionel. Hannah looked at the Empress and told her to eat slowly. The Empress sighed heavily and agreed with her. Hannah looked at the servant and asked what happened. The servant looked at her and handed over the document. He said that an additional budget was allocated, and the corresponding document was sent to us for verification. Hannah looked at the Empress and handed her the document. The Empress looked at the servant in surprise and asked where this document came from. Adelaide looked at him and asked if the Emperor had really sent the document. The servant hesitated and in turn timidly said that this was not so, and that this document had been sent from the Ivory Palace. Adelaide sighed heavily as she realized that she was still doing such things. Adelaide knew that it was impossible not to choke, since the Empress's additional funds were allocated by the Emperor's mistress. The Empress looked at the servant and told him to urge. Outside, the servant obediently went out. Adelaide looked at Hannah and asked if she could find out the total budget of the Imperial Palace. Hannah said that of course she could do it. The Empress looked at Hannah and said that she would like to see it, so she asked her to bring the relevant papers. Hannah said that she understood her and would do everything. Hannah looked at the Empress and asked if something was wrong, and that the numbers were confusing her. Adelaide handed Hannah the documents and didn't tell her to look at them herself. She asked her what she thought about them. Hannah looked at the documents in shock. She was in shock and could not believe that such things were written in the documents. Hannah looked at the Empress. Adelaide looked at her with an angry look and said that she couldn't even buy one horse with that amount, not even a thoroughbred one, but one that life had already managed to toss around. The Empress said that if she was right, then the funds allocated for the maintenance of the Ivory Palace should belong to her palace. Hannah said that she was right because this budget was much higher than the norm. The Empress looked closely at Hannah. She realized that she needed to meet Diana. Diana, in turn, asked in surprise whether she really should reconsider the decision to finance the Empress's palace. The servant looked at Diana and said that everything was correct. Diana in turn agreed and said that she would now redo everything. A couple of minutes later, she looked at the service and told him to take the documents. She said that she hoped the Empress would be pleased with this, and the amount. The servant looked at her in surprise and asked if she had finished already. Diana looked at the servant in surprise and asked if he really thought she would do something like that all day long. She told him to go and bring it to her immediately. The Empress, in turn, looked closely at the document. She realized that the answer came very quickly, and this meant that Diana was still in control of the additional budget. The Empress tore up the document and told the servant to come to her again. Diana sighed heavily and said that apparently the Empress wanted luxury. Diana looked at the maid and said that she had given the Empress a sufficient amount, and the maid in turn confirmed this. Diana looked at the servant and said that he could go free. She looked at the maid and told her to bring her the most modest dress. Diana told the maid to immediately inform His Majesty that the Empress had called her to her regarding the additional budget, and she was very afraid and did not know what to do. Diana said with a grin that now she would go catch the dark-haired animals. Meanwhile, the Empress was reading the Code of Laws. She was very happy because she found the point she needed. The Empress has the exclusive right to make decisions about the acquisition of the palace residence. This provision is stated in the laws of the imperial palace. The Empress looked at the Hannah and said that the Emperor had the exclusive right to distribute additional funds, and this law was created just for her case. Hannah looked at the Empress and said that she should still be careful, because these laws are like swords with two edges, and if she starts swinging them, she might only harm herself. Adelaide said that she was an empress, but she sat and begged for money from the Emperor's mistress, and his mistress took pity on her and added another silver bar to her budget. The Empress sighed heavily and said that the Emperor started swinging that sword first, but she got hurt too many times. Hannah sighed heavily and said that she didn't dare to contradict him. The Empress looked at her and asked what she should do to correct the matter that had already been completed. The Khan said that she should return the documents and reissue the order. The Empress looked at her and asked why she was still there. Adelaide said that she was demanding permission to live in Diana's palace. Adelaide wondered where the Empress's power came from. She knew that power came from those close to her, or it arose with the birth of the heir to the throne. She remembered her mother telling her to leave immediately. Adelaide remembered the Emperor, who told her with a grin that if she asked him to hug her, he would do it. The Empress was furious, as she was irritated by the actions of the Emperor and others. The Empress also needs an advisor, with whose help the Empress gains independent power. A moment later, the Empress felt a familiar feeling, all with the speed of lightning. She ran to the window, but saw nothing but, still she understood that it was definitely the energy of the tower. The maid entered the Empress's office and said that Madame Diana was asking for an audience with her. The Empress was a little surprised, since Diana herself decided to come to her. Adelaide looked at the maid and told her to take the guest to the living room. Diana greeted the Empress and said that she was very glad to meet them. The Empress looked at Diana in surprise and asked if she had really brought what Adelaide had requested from her through a servant. Diana said that this was indeed the case. The young lady looked at the Empress and asked what exactly she was unhappy about. The Empress was surprised and looked at the concubine angrily. She understood that there was a reason why she was unhappy, and the concubine was pretending not to understand, thereby provoking her. Diana looked at the Empress with the most innocent look. She smiled and said that she did not understand what the reason was. The Empress looked closely at the concubine and told her to look at the documents. Diana looked at Hannah in surprise, as she did not expect to see her, but still Diana cast an angry glance at the woman. The Empress looked at the concubine and said that now she could see in front of her the budget that was allocated for the Ivory Palace. Diana understood that the Empress had begun to use her title and put pressure on her. Diana said that she was very sorry, but still did not understand why she was showing it to her. Diana knew that the Empress had neither the love of the king nor relatives who could stand up for her. Adelaide looked intently at the concubine and with a smile said that she would like to ask her a question. A moment later, the Empress asked her why there was no report on the expenses of her domains. Diana froze in place from such a question. Adelaide looked at her and said that the expenses for materials, labor, all other institutions of the imperial palace have these documents, but since the Ivory Palace does not have a single report, only the allocated and spent amount, the Empress looked at the concubine and asked if she knew the reason for such a mistake. Diana froze in indignation. She did not know what to answer but still decided to go on. The offensive. Diana looked at the Empress and asked why she was even interested in the budget of the Ivory Palace. The Empress smiled and said that it was necessary to know the budget in order to transfer the amount intended for the Ivory Palace to the Empress's palace. The maid flew into the Emperor's office with lightning speed. The Emperor looked at her, in surprise, asked what happened. The maid, puzzled, asked for forgiveness for disturbing him. She said that the Empress had called her mistress to her. The Emperor looked at the maid in surprise and asked why the Empress had called Diana to her. The maid said that I had sent the Empress documents about the additional budget, but the Empress had ordered them to be redone twice. The maid said that the mistress was shaking so much as she walked towards the Empress, and she could not bear to watch it. So the maid came to the Emperor and asked the Emperor for support. The Emperor was shocked. He understood that now she was like a lump in his throat. He looked at the servant and asked if the Empress herself had really called her. Diana looked at the Empress in surprise and asked if she really wanted to take funds from her budget and appropriate them for herself. Adelaide looked at the concubine with a grin and said that this is exactly what she was going to do. Adelaide told her that she had previously been doing the things that an empress should be doing. It was clear that she had received her budget. Adelaide said that since she was now the empress here, she should do her duties, and the funding would be directed to this palace. Adelaide looked at her and asked if she agreed with her. Diana, in turn, froze in place in surprise. She did not know what to answer to such a question. The Empress looked closely at the concubine and said with a grin that she in turn had worked hard. Adelaide said that she was very grateful to her, so now she would not make her write an expense report. Adelaide said that she could handle it herself, and the young lady could redirect the budget of the Elephant Palace to her. The young lady understood that the Empress, even without relatives or followers nearby, was still the Empress. She could not refuse to carry out this order because she was not in a position to contradict her. The Empress looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was upset. Diana was shocked by such a statement. She knew that this was a palace. This was a sitting place next to the Emperor where she could look down on him. All of this belonged to her. She knew that everything had to be hers. Adelaide suddenly remembered the words of her mother, who told her to renounce the inheritance. She told her that she needed to return the title of heir. The Empress was furious, because now the expression on the young lady's face reminded her of her old days. Because of one word she lost her position. The Empress looked at the young lady and asked if she really thought that she had taken her place from her. Adelaide looked at her and told her to listen to her carefully. Adelaide said that she was the Empress. She told her not to try to take away her power. Adelaide said that no matter how much she dug into it, she would not let her get away with it. Adelaide looked at her with a piercing gaze and told her not to think that she had deprived her of everything. The Empress said that initially none of this belonged to her. Adelaide knew that if the girl stopped hoping for her power, she would no longer take anything away. Adelaide knew that this was the best thing she could do for her. The young lady froze at the Empress's words. She was shocked and furious. Diana knew that the Empress should not speak like that, since all the power had long belonged to her. In her mind, she screamed and called for the Emperor. She was furious and did not understand why he had not come yet. A moment later, the Empress heard a noise outside the door. Adelaide was a little surprised, as she was not expecting anyone else. A moment later, the door swung open, and the Emperor walked angrily into the room. He looked at them with fury and asked what was going on here. Diana fell to her knees and began to beg Her Majesty for forgiveness. She did not stop screaming, and at the same time, she was filled with bitter tears. She asked the Empress for forgiveness several times. The Empress froze in bewilderment. She did not understand what was going on at all. She understood that the young lady was simply provoking the Emperor. The Emperor looked at his wife with a dull expression and asked what she had done with Diana. The Empress looked at the concubine and told her to stand up, but the young lady continued to sit on her knees and cry. The Empress looked at the concubine with surprise and anger and told her to quickly get up, and also asked what suddenly came over her in the middle of the conversation. Diana cried and asked the Empress for forgiveness, and also told her not to be angry with her. The Emperor looked at the Empire tradition with anger and shouted at her. Adelaide looked at the Emperor in surprise and asked what he was doing here. The maid approached Diana and helped her to stand up. The Emperor looked at the maid and said that she would take Diana to her palace. The Emperor looked at all the servants with anger and told them to all leave quickly, as he needed to immediately speak with the Empress in private. The Empress gave him an angry look. She was furious at such an attitude towards herself. The Emperor looked sideways at Hannah and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. Hannah smiled and bowed politely. She said that she was very glad to meet him again. The Emperor looked at her, said that she had not changed at all, and again stood next to the Empress. He looked at her and asked if she was really watching the Empress destroy weak people. The Emperor looked at her and asked her angrily if this was really amusing. Hannah froze in bewilderment. Looking at the Emperor, she did not expect him to say something like that. The Empress looked at Hannah and told her to also go out and wait outside. The Emperor looked at her with fury and asked if this was really amusing her. He shouted that he had asked her a question. The Empress shouted angrily and told the woman to wait outside. Hannah, in turn, bowed politely, said nothing, and left. The Emperor looked at the Empress with fury and asked what she was doing. Adelaide looked at him and shouted what he was doing here. He asked with fury if she really enjoyed watching a weak person beg for forgiveness. The Emperor looked at her and said that she had very bad interests. Adelaide looked at him and said with fury that this was not so. The Emperor said that he personally witnessed it, and she did not need to try to justify herself to him now. The Empress looked at the Emperor with an angry look and said that if he was acting like this because of his concubine, then he should know that as soon as the door opened, she knelt down in front of her and began to beg her. As soon as he entered the room, "Darling," the Emperor asked, "was this just a coincidence?" He looked at the Empress and asked if she was jealous of her. He looked at the Empress with anger and asked if she really wanted to get what belonged to her. Adelaide said that if she thought about it, it was not she who was invading personal boundaries, but he. Adelaide asked if he had seen the budget allocated to this palace. Adelaide sighed heavily and said that of course he had not seen it because it had been hidden from him. The Empress looked at the Emperor and handed him the documents. She told him to look at them, since the amount that the concubine had allocated would not even cover an old horse. The Empress asked if the Empress's palace could be run on such a small budget. The Emperor froze in bewilderment at what he saw, and he did not answer the question asked. A moment later, he looked at the Empress and asked if this was the reason she had called the concubine. The Empress looked at him and said that she wanted Diana to do it in front, but she came to her herself. The Emperor looked at her and said that it turned out the Empress had not called her. The Empress, in turn, looked at the Emperor with a grin, since he now understood everything. The Emperor looked at his wife and said that her mother, the Empress, had lied to him. He said that she had said that she was an obedient and devoted daughter, but after being exiled from her own country, nothing had changed. The Empress looked angrily at her husband and said that if he did not know the real reason why she had to leave her own empire, then it was better for him not to raise this topic. He came closer to her and told her to listen to him carefully. He said that like feathers on a pen, like a flower in a vase, she should live exactly like that. He looked at his wife with fury and asked if she understood him. The Empress gave the Emperor an angry look, but did not answer. For a moment the Empress was taken aback as she felt familiar feelings, and Karl looked at her in surprise. A moment later, the Empress pushed him away and ran to the window. When she went out onto the balcony, she saw a red light. She saw how the sky became overcast and turned red. All the servants looked intently at the sky and trembled with fear. All the people who were in the castle were in shock as they saw the tower coming down. The Empress froze in place. She remembered the words of the Emperor, who said that she needed to live like flowers in a vase or like feathers on a pen. Hannah ran up to the Empress and asked if she was okay. She said that the portal was descending now and she needed to hide immediately. The Empress looked at her and said that she would not hide and would not leave. Everyone in the palace was screaming because they understood that monsters were about to attack the palace. The young man sighed heavily and said that it seemed to him that this tower was of the 4th or maybe even 5th level. Lionel sighed heavily and said that it was good that it was directed at the garden, since it would have been more difficult for them to stop the invasion if the structures had been affected. Lionel shouted to his boys to get into position and prepare for battle immediately. Looking at the bunks and the kings, he said that as soon as the portal touches the earth, monsters will start coming out of it. They must stop them before the magicians appear. Lionel looked at his comrade and asked when the magicians would arrive. The young man said that he did not know. Lionel understood that they would appear again after the knights had all died to the last one. Lionel shouted to his subordinates to go to the residence of the magicians immediately and bring them here. Those who can freely use power and control the towers are called mages. Lennox Poitier, vice captain of the Mage's Order, is a first-class first-tier striker in the Empire. It is not for nothing that he received the title of Count, despite his commoner origin. He looked at the young man and asked with a grin, "Is it really asking him to come right now?" The young man looked at him with fury and said that this was an order from the Minister of Defense, and all magicians must arrive at the Rose Garden, where the tower descends. Lennox sighed heavily and said that it was problematic now, and the order belonged to the Emperor, not the minister, and he would not follow the orders of an ordinary minister. Lennox cursed because he had buttoned the button incorrectly. The young man in turn, the Knight Jackal, looked at the magician in bewilderment. He was angry. Lennox looked at the knight and said with a grin that they said their wages were being delayed this time. Lennox said with a grin that he was the second son of Count Jackal. Lennox looked at the knight with disdain and said that his subordinates must have a hard time. He said that he could give them one of his buttons. He said that it was made of gold, so it could be sold for a decent amount. The knight looked at the magician with fury and asked if instead of talking such nonsense, he could start preparing for the appearance of the tower. Lennox looked at the knight and said with a grin that he had better not talk to him in such a tone, because they really needed his help now, and the longer he delayed, the more losses their knightly corps would suffer. The knight was furious. He shouted that a misfortune had befallen the palace. He asked the magician if he thought the magicians would be safe. He said that everyone would have to be responsible for this. Lennox said with a grin that even if other mages were reprimanded, he still wouldn't be among them. The magician approached the knight and with a contemptuous grin said that for this reason he should stop getting on his nerves. He said that he might appear after all these little bugs die. The knight was furious at the magician's statement. He could not stand it. But still, he understood that he had no way out and needed to fix himself. At this moment he knelt before the magician and asked for his help. Lennox was a little surprised, and this behavior chilled him to the bone. He madly adored the color of blood, those pieces of hell that descended from heaven as gifts from God. Lionel shouted to everyone to beware of the debris and to be careful not to be carried away by the updraft. Lionel looked at the knight and asked if the magicians had arrived to them. The recipe in turn looked at the commander in confusion and said that they had not arrived yet. Lionel knew that they wouldn't arrive on time this time, but he still knew that he had to protect all the warriors. A moment later, he heard someone calling him. He turned around in surprise and saw the Empress, who asked him why he was just watching. Lionel looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect her to come to such a place. Lionel looked at the Empress in shock and asked what she was doing here without an escort. He said that she needed to hide as quickly as possible. Lionel looked at the knight and told him to escort Her Majesty to safety. Adelaide looked at Lionel and asked where their mages were. She said that the tower was almost down. She asked furiously why they didn't destroy it. She looked at him and asked if everyone was waiting for her to touch the ground. Lionel looked at her and told her that she needed to take cover quickly. Lionel glanced sideways at the tower and realized that it was approaching. He told the Empress that it was very dangerous here and she needed to stand behind him. But a moment later he felt magic. Turning around, he saw a group of magicians who were approaching them. Lionel Mustache sighed in relief as they arrived to them. The knights in turn whispered and wondered if the magicians really arrived to them slowly. Lionel was a little puzzled, as he knew that the magicians were still very far away. He wondered who had just used magic. The Empress looked at the tower and sighed heavily, and said that this tower was level 4, but it was not as dangerous as it seemed, so they could not wait for help. A moment later she grabbed her sword and prepared to attack. Lionel looked at the Empress in surprise and asked what she was going to do now. The Empress said that she wanted to destroy this tower. The Empress rushed towards the tower. Lionel, in turn, shouted and called for the Empress. Lionel shouted at her that she couldn't go into the tower. He shouted that if she went there, she might be carried away by the updraft, but she did not listen to him. Lionel was surprised, as he noticed that his hand was pushed away, and it was real magic. The Empress looked at him and told him not to worry about her and not to disturb her. A moment later she rushed to the tower. Lionel was in shock. He had been shouting at the Empress all this time that she should not go there. But still she did not listen to him, and did it her own way. The knights froze in bewilderment. They were in shock, because they did not expect the Empress to destroy the tower. Lionel looked at his subordinates, and told them to pull themselves together. He told them to watch closely, both of you, and not miss the moment when Her Majesty falls. Lennox looked at the tower in shock, and said that the Empress had been carried away by the stream. He looked at the Mago and told them to create a protective barrier around the tower. He said that the magic should completely surround the area, so that during the fall, Her Majesty would not be harmed. But a moment later, they noticed something looking at the tower of the Magi. They saw that it was collapsing. Lionel froze in surprise as he saw the tower burning in flames, the knight shouting to stop the magic from spreading flames all around. The knight approached his commander and told him to give them an order. Lionel froze in surprise. He saw her special suit, the sword, attached to her back, and this strong magic that did not allow him to stop her. Lionel said that he needed to wait a little. He remembered her saying that they had flying monsters, and in Amont, their tower was assigned to the middle class. A moment later, he saw the Empress fall to the ground. No matter how much she looked at the distant sky, after the destruction of the tower, it would always excite her to her and told her to stop. He asked what would happen if she died. Adelaide looked at him and told him to stop saying such words, since it was her hobby. Although she was reproached for this hobby, she could not do anything about it. She decided to throw away unnecessary thoughts and realized that it was time for her to land. A moment later, she saw Lionel reaching out his hands towards her. He wanted to catch her. She was a little surprised, as she didn't expect him to act like that. The Empress, in turn, looked intently at the young man, not taking her gaze off him. But a moment later she used magic and landed on her own. Lionel looked at her in surprise. The Empress looked at him with an embarrassed smile and asked if he really wanted to help her. Lionel smiled and said that was true. The Empress looked at him intently and said that he was a knight with a sword, and perhaps he would have lost his hands for such a thing. God of those who scolded her, but until now she had not met a man who would try to catch her. The Empress looked at the young man with a smile and thanked him for his help. And she also said that she was also grateful to him for yesterday. Lionel looked after her intently. He said nothing. He was surprised and wondered how she could smile so radiantly. Lionel wondered if this was not the woman who had been so gloomy yesterday. The Empress came closer to the magicians. They were wary, but also looked at her with horror. The Empress looked at Lennox with disdain and asked if he would sheathe his sword already. The Empress looked at him and said with a smile that he would no longer need the sword. Lennox looked after the Empress in shock. The other Mac was surprised. He asked in a trembling voice if she had really destroyed the tower alone. Lennox froze in surprise as he realized that the Empress turned out to be a magician. Hannah stared out the window, wondering if the tower had been destroyed. Hannah looked at the Empress in surprise and asked why she was like that. Hannah told the Empress that she was very worried about her. The Empress, in turn, sighed heavily and said that the tower no longer existed. The Empress said that she had dealt with her. The Khan looked at the Empress in surprise and asked what she was talking about. A moment later, the Empress fell to the floor unconscious. The young ladies whispered quietly. They were surprised that Her Highness the Empress had destroyed the tower on her own. They said that she was a great magician. They said that she had even flown up and dealt with the portal herself, and all this had happened before the tower had fallen from the ground. They said that the captain of the magical squad, the Duke, would obviously try to lure her away. They said that if she was capable of such a thing, then she was much stronger than Lennox, but they were still perplexed and did not understand why Gautroff sent his princess to their empire if she was a magician of such a level. Lionel sighed heavily. The past minutes reminded him of a dream. He remembered how the Empress said that this tower was level 4, but it was not as dangerous as it seemed, so they could not wait for help. He remembered how he wanted to stop her, but unfortunately, he did not succeed since she used magic. He was very surprised and wondered what it was. Powerful magic. He understood that it was much stronger than the catastrophe that was descending from the heavens. He remembered how the Empress, like a beautiful fairy, descended after a difficult battle. The Duke looked at Lennox in surprise and asked if the Empress was a magician. Lennox, in turn, said that this was indeed the case. The man looked at the young man in surprise and asked if she had really overcome the tower without anyone's help. The young man said that she really did it herself. Thought for a moment. He said that the Empress was not as simple as they thought. The princess of a distant country, who was thrown out of her home, turned out to be a mago and also a striker. The man sighed heavily and said that the Empress was more amazing than he thought. Lennox was furious. Everything was infuriating him. He understood that he could easily deal with a tower of that level himself. He should have appeared after the arrogant knights realized their insignificance. But he was angry that the Empress had ruined everything. The young man burst into his sister's room and called her. The young lady looked at her brother in surprise, as she didn't expect him to do something like that. Diana looked at him and asked if he hadn't been taught to knock. He looked at her and asked if she hadn't gotten pregnant yet. The young lady looked at her brother and angrily told him to stop. Already, she said that it was not only up to her. He looked at her with surprise and rage and asked what she would do. Now the young lady looked at her brother in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. He looked at her and said that the Empress turned out to be a high-class magician and also a striker. Diana looked at her brother in shock and asked what he was talking about. She couldn't understand and wondered if the Empress really was a striker. The young man looked at his sister and said that this was exactly how it was. The young lady was furious at what she heard. Now she understood who really destroyed the tower. The young man looked at his sister and said with rage that this was exactly how it was, and that it was the Empress who destroyed the tower. Diana was furious, as she had been praying very hard for some puppet to take the place of the Empress. But in turn, the Empress was not so simple, and she was actually a high-class magician. The young man looked at his sister and said that the Duke said that the Empress was simply excellent. Lennox asked his sister what if the Duke no longer needs him. She looked at her brother with fury and asked if he didn't know this Duke. She said that if he was so useless to begin with, the Duke wouldn't have taken him in to begin with. Diana looked at her brother and told him not to worry. She asked what happened to the Empress being a magician. He looked at his sister in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Diana said that he was still the strongest striker in the empire. She looked at him with fury, told him to pull himself together and stop whining. She said that she would definitely take care of the emperor herself. She came closer to him and said that nothing would change, so he should not worry in vain. She came closer to him and asked if he understood her. The young man said that he understood everything he said, that the Empress alone could not do anything. Diana was furious because she and her brother had been through a lot. She knew that such a trifle could not shake their position. Diana looked at her brother and said with fury that she did not care who the Empress really was. She said that he who laughs last laughs best. Adelaide's decision to deal with the tower alone was described in one word. When the tower, which is the source of magical power, disappears, the suddenly influx of mana begins to dry up and leads to exhaustion. Hannah was very worried about the Empress. She spent all her free time next to her. She heard the servants whispering and saying that the Empress had destroyed the tower on her own. They said that the royal knights were so inspired by her because the Mage squad had arrived too late. If it weren't for the Empress, the losses among the knights would have been huge. Hannah looked at the servant and told him to give the letter to the Grand Duchess. The Emperor looked intently out the window and thought about the whole situation. The servant came closer to the Emperor and said that the tower was descending and he needed to hide urgently. The Emperor came closer to him and told him not to panic. Diana knew that it wouldn't be difficult to destroy a tower of that level, and he needed to tell them to deal with it quickly. But a moment later he saw that the tower had started to burn. The Emperor wondered if a squad of magicians had arrived. The Emperor looked at the servants and asked who did this. The servant looked at the Emperor and said that Her Majesty, the Empress, had destroyed the tower. The only true information that was sent to him from Gautroff about his princess was her gender and name. The Emperor thought that perhaps Empress Gautroff was not sure that she could have influence over her daughter and sent her to them in the empire. The Emperor looked at his service and told him to go to Gautroff to find out more about the Empress. The servant looked at the Emperor and bowed obediently. He said that he would do everything immediately. Hannah looked at the Empress and asked if she was awake, yet asked her how she felt. The Empress gave Hannah a radiant smile and greeted her. Hannah saw that the Empress was already feeling much better. Adelaide looked at Hannah and said that she would like to place an advertisement for an assistant. The Empress said it must be a man over 20 years old. If the candidate has a fiancé, he will be excluded. The Empress said she will make the choice after the interview, and it will depend. Hannah looked at the Empress in surprise and asked what the interview would depend on. The Empress looked at Hannah with a grin and said that he would depend on her desire. The Empress's announcement of the search for assistants stirred up the secular society of the empire. The Duke that Valdor was no exception. The servant approached the master and said that the announcement at the moment was not too simple. The young man looked at the servant and said that it was better this way than meaningless formulations. He looked at the service and asked what the Empress wanted. He asked if she was trying to oppose His Majesty or create a new independent force against Diana. Lionel sat quietly and did not answer his brother. He interrupted while he was deep in thought. The young man looked at his brother and asked what he thought about this. A moment later, Lionel said that it was possible to do both. The young man looked at the spot insolently and asked if she was just having fun. He said that there was one condition, namely the Empress wrote that she would like to see a man next to her that she liked. They knew that one way or another, the Empress published it, and they could not ignore it. They wondered who they should entrust this task to. They knew that first of all, it was necessary for this family to have a long-standing relationship with the Valdor family. Also serving as an assistant to the Empress, one must be competent enough. The young man said that it would also be necessary to counter gossip about the Empress's affair. Usually the Empress's assistants were from the Cedro clan. Lionel looked at his brother and asked if Her Majesty had not given the Earl a gold bar. He said that His Majesty would not be pleased. Lionel said that it was also possible that the Empress's views on the tower were a little different from the other mages. He looked at his brother and asked what he meant by that. Lionel said that this was an advert for a helper. He looked at his brother and asked if he really had someone in mind. Lionel looked at his brother and said that he would be the one to become it. The young man was alarmed by his brother's statement and said that he should not do that. Lionel looked at Michael and asked if there was anyone else he could send. As a candidate, Lionel said he didn't think so. The young man said that it was not a bad idea. At least all 3 sons of Count Voldor were close, but the youngest was not even 20 years old. He looked at his brother and said that he would get nothing out of it. He said that if he became an assistant, then everyone would mock him as the Empress's lover. Lionel looked at his brother in surprise and asked what the problem was. Lionel said that they simply had no choice. He said that just yesterday, Lennox had deliberately ignored his order and he couldn't even properly object as a mage, even though he was the Minister of Defense. His brother didn't answer him. He was confused because he knew that Lionel was right. Lionel said that everything they knew about the towers was a mere pittance compared to the Empress's knowledge, since she was better informed about everything than they were. Lionel said that if he became an assistant, he could get information, and they could move forward with the case. The young man thought for a moment, as he was surprised that someone from the Voldor would be an assistant. He looked at Lionel and said that if their mother were alive, she would hit him for that. Lionel smiled and said that he of course understood everything. The young man looked at them and asked what would happen if the Empress did not choose Lionel. He looked at them and asked where such groundless self-confidence came from. The young man was taken aback and looking at them said that they would still choose him, since all he would need to do was dress nicely. Diana sat in the Emperor's office and watched him closely. Diana was a little surprised and puzzled, as he did not say a word to her, even though he had seen the Empress that day. A moment later, the Emperor said that if she was not feeling well, she could go to the palace and rest. He said that she did not have to be here. The young lady looked at the Emperor and said that she heard that Her Majesty had posted an advertisement looking for an assistant. Diana said that it has been less than a month since their wedding, and she is already looking for an assistant. Diana said that she is very worried about this. The young lady came closer to the Emperor and said that she was very curious about who it would be. The Emperor gave her a cold look and said that it was none of her concern, so she should not think about it. The young lady looked at the Emperor in surprise. She didn't expect him to be so cold to her. A moment later, she said that in that case, she would go and leave him. The Emperor looked at the young lady and told her to take care of the Empress's budget so that this issue would not come up again. The young lady froze in surprise. She was in shock because he was cold. Carl was both heaven and hell for her. He had too much importance in her life, both now and in the future. The Emperor, in turn, sat puzzled in his office and thought about what was happening. The Emperor looked at the servant and told him to inform him of the current situation with the Empress's announcement. The servant said that 16 people had applied so far, the second son of Baron Armandi Viscount Valved. The Emperor was puzzled. Although it was announced only in the morning, all the families flocked like bees. The Emperor asked if there were people related to the Valdor family. The servant looked at the Emperor and said that not yet. The Emperor told him that if news suddenly appeared, he should immediately inform him. The Emperor said that since the Duke and his successor could not speak directly, they would send someone from the relevant families. Hannah frowned and said that this was the end of the report on the political figures of the empire. The Empress said that she understood why the previous Empress was so kind to her. The Empress said with a smile that it was a very good job. Hannah smiled and told the Empress that she was just exaggerating. Adelaide said that no matter how you look at it, it would be best to accept the candidate into the Duchy of Valdor. The Empress asked her assistant if the interview would begin soon. Number 1. The young man smiled and said that the moment he first saw her, Tony could take his gaze off her. He said that she was like an angel. The Empress was surprised that they were telling her something like that. She wondered if her nickname was not Gottroff's witch. Candidate number 2 trembled before the Empress. He said with a smile that it was a great honor for him to meet her personally. He said that he was very nervous and felt as if he were in a dream. Adelaide was in shock, as she now also felt as if she were in a dream. Candidate number 3 amazed her. With his strength, he shouted that he was very strong and could break an apple in half. Candidate number 4, with a wide smile, said that he sang beautifully and asked her if she wanted to listen to him sing. The Empress was in shock. She didn't know when it would stop. She wondered why this announcement was needed at all. She realized that no one understood its true meaning. The Empress was a little puzzled, as still no one from the Valdor side had come to her. Hannah looked at the Empress and asked not to send the others back if she was already tired. The Empress looked at her and asked if they were finished already. Hannah said that they were, but there were still people. The Empress looked at her and told her to put the next one down, as it was better to finish this as quickly as possible. Hannah came out to the young men and said that she would go next. She thought for a moment. A moment later, everyone looked at the Minister of Defense in shock. The young people whispered to each other and couldn't believe what they were seeing. They wondered if he had actually applied. The candidates for the position of Her Majesty's assistant looked closely at the young man. The young people understood that a direct descendant of the Voldor had just arrived, and the choice was already obvious. Hannah looked at Sir Lionel and greeted him with a smile. Lionel smiled and said that he hoped he was not late. Hannah looked at him sharply and said he would have to wait a little while. Lionel said he would definitely do so. The young man looked at the Empress and greeted her. The Empress looked at him and told him to start speaking. She thought for a moment as something had happened. She realized that the young man standing in front of her was different from all the others who had come before. He seemed less motivated than the previous applicants. The Empress sighed heavily and said that finally everything was over. She was glad that it was the last candidate, but she still understood that unfortunately she had not chosen anyone. Hannah looked at the Empress and said that there was still some left. The Empress looked at her assistant in surprise and asked if they hadn't finished. Yet Hannah said that at the end, another one had applied. Hannah handed the papers to the Empress, and she looked and saw that Lionel had applied for the assistant position. She was a little surprised. A moment later, the Empress said that he could come in. Lionel entered the Empress's office and greeted her. The Empress greeted him with a smile on her face and said that he could sit down. The Empress looked at him and told him to understand her because they do not serve tea. The same happened with other statements. The young man looked at her and said that he understood everything. The young man saw the Empress's tense gaze. As expected, she was not looking for entertainment. He looked at her and asked if she wanted to balance the forces. Lionel asked her if she needed support. He looked at her and said that in this place where there is no one to rely on, someone is needed with whom hand in hand one can resist the one who has already occupied the palace. He looked at her with a piercing gaze and asked if she needed an assistant for this purpose. Lionel looked at her intently and said that whoever she chose would not be able to help her. As he did, Adelaide was surprised, as he had correctly understood her intention. She looked at him and said they were just considering the proposal, and she called him sir, and she looked at him and asked if she should call him minister. Lionel looked at the Empress and told her to call him whatever she liked. She looked at him and said that anyway, he had said earlier that he wanted to be her assistant. Lionel said that was correct. Adelaide looked at him with a keen gaze and asked why he came in person, since he was a direct descendant of the Valdor. She said that he could have sent a suitable person from a vassal family. The young man looked at the Empress and said that she had the information he needed about the tower. The Empress thought about this for a moment, looked at him, and asked if he really needed information about the tower more than the position of assistant to the Empress. Lionel looked at the Empress and answered without hesitation that it was so. She looked at him and said that he had said earlier that she could address him however she wanted, and the young man looked at her and said that was true. The Empress looked at him and called him by name. She said that the assistant was being chosen for the purpose of establishing the opposition, located in the imperial palace. Adelaide looked at him intently and said that he understood her intentions exactly. She looked at him with a smirk and said that he would have to pretend to be her lover. Adelaide asked if he understood this or not. The young man froze for a moment and did not answer this question. She looked at him and said with a smirk that it would be right if she called him by his name to make it look like he was her lover. The Empress looked at him with a fixed gaze and said that if he did not object to this, the position of assistant would be reserved for him. The young man looked at her intently and said that he agreed. He said that he did not care that he would be considered her lover. Lionel looked at the Empress and asked her to appoint him to this position. The Empress was a little surprised, but still very glad that everything turned out this way, since she found herself an assistant who was to her liking. The Emperor looked at the servant in shock and asked who had applied for the position of assistant. The servant was taken aback and hesitated, but a moment later he said that the application had been submitted by Sir Lionel Walder. The Emperor looked at the servant in surprise and wondered if he had really applied for the position of the Empress's lover. The servant looked at the Emperor in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Emperor asked if the Empress had chosen him. The servant said that it was not certain. Yet since Her Majesty, the Empress had not yet made any official statements. The Emperor looked closely at the servant. He understood that everything was obvious here. The Emperor went out onto the balcony. He was deep in thought. The unknown sweetness that emanated from her could still be felt in his nose. He remembered how she sat beautifully in front of him and asked how about having dinner together the day the Empress came to him. He was intoxicated by her scent, but still he spent the night with Diana. The Emperor knew that she was a woman born of noble blood and held a high position. He wondered how he could weaken her. He saw her arrogant look. He did not know how he should act in this situation. He only looked at her for a moment, but she was in his thoughts, wondering if it was so hard to just exist without attracting attention, wondering if it wasn't a comfortable life, living like a platform pen or like flowers in a vase. He knew that when an animal bares its fangs and shows its claws, it must be tamed. And in order to tame an animal wandering in the mountains, one must first pull out these fangs and claws. The Empress sighed heavily. It seemed to her that the fatigue that had accumulated over the day was finally leaving. Hannah looked at the Empress and called her. The Empress looked at Hannah intently and said that she would be coming out. Soon Hannah was taken aback and said that this was very good. The Empress looked at Hannah in surprise and asked if something had happened. Hannah looked intently at the Empress and said that His Majesty had come to see her. Adelaide looked at her in surprise and asked if the Emperor had really come to see her. The Empress was surprised and did not understand what he wanted from her. The Empress sighed heavily and said that the Emperor was probably going to ask about her new personal assistant. Adelaide smiled and said that she had to listen to what he had to say about this situation. After long preparations, the Empress came out to meet the Emperor. The Emperor looked at her intently and in surprise. The Empress looked at him and said that she didn't know that he had decided to visit her. Because of this, it took her longer to get ready. She looked at him and asked what happened. The Emperor looked closely at the Empress and asked whom she had appointed as her assistant. The Empress, in turn, looked at him in surprise and asked if she should really tell the Emperor about this. He looked at her with fury and asked again whom she would choose as her assistant. She was surprised and asked with a smirk if she really had to get permission from him. The Empress said that whoever she chose was her decision alone, and he didn't need to ask about it. The Emperor looked angrily at his wife and asked if she had chosen Lionel Valdora. The Empress of the University, in turn, looked at him in surprise and asked what if this was so. Carl told her to choose someone else. Adelaide looked at him in surprise and asked why she should do that. The emperor said that the Valdor family was rebelling against the imperial family. Karl asked if she would really take such a person as her assistant. He said with fury that there was a limit to his patience. Karl said the Empress, so that she behaved according to her title. The Empress was a little surprised and dumbfounded. She understood that she had nothing to be ashamed of. She looked at him and asked if he hadn't told her before to live like a pen on a handle or like flowers in a vase. The emperor looked closely at his wife and said that he had told her something similar before she had said that he wanted her to be a resource. The empress looked at him and asked if she really needed to not live, but exist without having her own opinion and always follow his will. The emperor looked at her intently and said that this was exactly what he wanted from her. He looked at her intently. The empress looked at him and asked if he was really asking now who she would choose. She said that she would choose Lionel Valdora. The emperor shouted angrily and called her the empress. Looked at the emperor intently. She repeated his words that he told her earlier that he would not pay attention to her lover, so he did not care what she did. She looked at him and said with a grin that these were his very words. The empress asked him if he had really forgotten about it. Adelaide looked at him and said that she would answer him in kind. She told him not to pay attention to her lover. He looked at her angrily and asked if she was protesting against him. She looked at him with a smirk and asked if he really thought, so she said that she had looked at many candidates over the past few days, but he was the only one who could catch her attention. The emperor looked at his wife with anger and said that it seemed she was forgetting herself. The empress told him that she was not going to be his accessory. The empress asked if he wanted her to fulfill her duties. She asked if he should not be the first to recognize her as his equal spouse. The emperor, in turn, silently turned around and walked towards the exit. A moment later, he angrily told her to make a wise decision so she wouldn't regret it later. The empress looked after him intently. She remembered her mother who told her that she needed to make a wise decision so as not to regret it later. Adelaide understood that now in front of her was the same person as her mother. She wondered if it was because of her luck that she only met such people. She thought that most likely such people just sat on the throne. The empress wondered how she could find a wise solution. Hannah looked at the evil emperor in surprise. The emperor came closer to her and asked angrily if she was now faithful to the empress. The emperor said that he was born a humble servant, became an emperor. Well, that he was born a man. He looked at her and asked if it was possible that he had usurped the place of Princess Elizabeth. Hannah looked at him intently and said that it was not so. The emperor said in a grave voice that it was a lie. The emperor looked at her and told her to tell the empress that in order for her to live well in this empire and in this palace, she must first please the owner. He looked at his nanny and said that in this way she could stay close to the empress. The empress was sitting quietly in her chambers. Hannah entered the room and called her the empress, looked at her in surprise, and asked if she had anything to say. Hannah said that she was appointed by the former empress to manage the palace and was also the princess's nanny. The empress said that she knew about it. Hannah said that there was another child that she took care of because of fact that it was unofficial. Not many people knew about it. Hannah said that she was the nanny of the current emperor. The empress looked at Hannah in surprise and asked why she was telling her this now. Hannah, in turn, said that deep in his heart there lives a child who has not yet grown up. He desperately wanted to be loved, but he never could, and that was what corrupted him. Diana greeted the emperor with a smile on her face. She was glad that he came to her. A moment later, she looked at him in surprise as she saw the expression on his face that upset her. The emperor looked coldly and angrily at the concubine. The young lady looked at him in surprise and called out. Diana asked the emperor if something had happened. She was surprised because she saw that he was very angry. Diana looked at the emperor with a smile on her face and asked if it was the empress who upset him. Diana said with a smirk that the empress did this to him again. She asked if it was because of the assistant. Diana said with a smirk that she really didn't understand. She wondered how anyone could hire Lionel as Her Majesty's assistant. The Emperor came closer to her and inhaled her scent. He was puzzled as he realized that it was not the scent he was looking for. The young lady looked at the Emperor in surprise and asked why he did this since he had never done this before. The Emperor looked at the young lady intently and told her to live like a pen on a pen and like flowers in a vase. The young lady looked at the Emperor in surprise. She said with a smile that this is what is needed for a comfortable life. She asked him with a smile on her face if she becomes the first on the handle, will he use it? She asked if she becomes flowers, will that vase be next to him? The young lady looked at the Emperor and said that she liked it if she was near him. Diana said that she only needed him. The Emperor, in turn, looked at her intently and said that in that case, she needed to be close. The young lady knew that soon you would only have her in his violet eyes. But a moment later, the Emperor stepped back from her. Diana looked at him in shock as she did not expect this. She looked after him in surprise and called him, but the Emperor did not answer. She was confused and didn't understand how this could even happen, since she knew he could never resist her. She furiously wondered what was going on. The story of Madame Giggs begins a long time ago. Her maid gave birth to a child from the Emperor. Then the stress of the Empress reached its limit. In addition, the Emperor took the child of the maid as an adopted son and appointed him heir. The child, separated from his biological mother, grew up in the Empress's palace, and no one took his opinion into account. At the age of 6, he learned the truth that the mother he considered his own was actually his stepmother who despised him. At the age of 7, he found his real mother, who was almost dying, and it was no longer possible to turn the axis that formed the child. The Empress sighed heavily and said that she now understood what had caused such hostility at their first meeting. Adelaide said that it turned out that the Emperor put her on the same level as the previous Empress. She said that she did not think that this was due to hostility towards the position of Empress itself. Hannah said it felt more like an unconscious instinct than a rational decision. The Empress said angrily that if the Emperor sitting on the throne thinks with his instincts and not with his head, it is a big problem. Hannah looked at her and said that, as the Empress had said, he was the Emperor and also her husband. The Empress looked at her in surprise and asked what she meant by this. Did she really need to humiliate herself and please the Emperor? The Empress said that on the very first day, Diana came to her and told her about His Majesty's tastes. Hannah looked at the Empress and said that it was very impudent of her. The Empress sighed heavily and said that this was true and very impudent. The Empress said that the young concubine told her to adjust her tastes and appearance to the tastes of the Emperor. The Empress looked at Hannah and asked how the words she had just said were different from Diana's words that day. Hannah froze in place and asked the Empress for forgiveness. She said that the most important thing for her was protecting herself, her ideal, her beliefs, her self-respect, and honor. It was all hers. The Empress sighed heavily and said that this was more important than the title of Empress. Adelaide said that she would never follow the orders of others and would not act as soon as someone sighed. Adelaide looked at Hannah and asked if she understood her. Hannah saw before her now the proud heir to the throne of the princess, born at birth. Hannah realized that she had crossed the line. Hannah looked at the Empress and asked her forgiveness for her words. Hannah looked at the Emperor and called him. A moment later, Hannah said that Her Majesty the Empress had already gone to bed. Hannah was surprised and did not understand what was the matter, since not even an hour had passed since he left the Empress's palace. The Emperor looked at Hannah intently and asked if it was possible to spend the night with the Empress tonight. Hannah looked at the Emperor in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Emperor looked at her and said that he saw that she was hesitating, which meant that anything was possible. A moment later, the Emperor furiously threw open the door to the Empress's room. Adelaide looked at the Emperor in surprise as she did not expect to see him in her chambers. She looked at him in surprise and asked what was happening now. The emperor came closer to her and said that he wanted to spend the night with her. The empress froze in place, in surprise. She did not expect something like this. She understood that the emperor always takes what he wants. He has no reason to hesitate and restrain his desires, even if the empress is in front of him. The emperor looked at her intently and said that she now had a murderous look. The empress looked at him in surprise and said that not even an hour had passed since he said so, that she would not regret her decision. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he suddenly wanted to spend their wedding night now. The emperor said that he remembered her words about him having to acknowledge her as his wife, and he said that in that case, that was the first step. He looked at her and said that it seemed she wanted to have more influence in the palace. He asked her, why go far? He came closer to her and said with a grin that this was another duty of the empress, and by fulfilling it, she would gain power. He said that he would put it right into her hands. The empress looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to hear something like that. A moment later, she looked at him and told him to let her go. The emperor smirked and said that she was very capricious. He asked if she really wanted to have influence without doing her duty. Adelaide understood that whether she liked it or not, the emperor was still her husband, and the wedding night was her duty. But she did not understand what this feigned feeling was now. Karl looked at her and asked why she did not accept it. He asked what was so humiliating about it. He asked if there was a man in this empire, except himself, who could persuade her. The empress looked at him puzzled and said that this was the first time she had heard that the empress had to bow before the emperor. She looked at him and asked if this was all the empress was worth in his empire. The emperor slowly descended to her feet, and she looked at him in surprise. A moment later, the emperor took her by the foot. She was amazed and did not understand what he was doing. A few minutes later, the emperor kissed her foot tenderly. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was doing. Now the emperor, in turn, looked intently at his wife and asked if she was pleased. He looked at her and moved closer. Karl said he bowed his head and kissed her foot. Adelaide looked at him intently and told him to let her go. The emperor looked at his wife with surprise and anger. Since he did not expect her to behave inappropriately, he looked at her and said that he saw that she did not understand. He sighed heavily, and as he left, said that all she had was her worthless pride, and she still bared her teeth at him. The emperor sighed heavily and said that he did not understand at all what she was thinking. The empress looked at him intently, but said nothing. The Karl looked at his wife with fury and told her to bow and bend over and kneel before him. Adelaide gave the emperor a cold and angry look. She said with fury that this would never happen. The emperor said with a grin that she would be the only one who would regret it. He left, and she fell onto the bed with a bang, shocked by everything that was happening. She remembered all her ill-wishers who told her not to do something she would regret. The empress woke up the next morning. She was exhausted. The empress wondered if it was just a dream. Hannah looked at the empress and asked if she was already awake. Adelaide looked at her in surprise and asked what was the matter. Hannah looked at the empress and said that there was an order from His Majesty to cancel the additional budget for the empress's palace. She froze in place. In surprise, she was furious and thought that the emperor was just a bastard. The empress wondered if the emperor would really act so meanly and cowardly. The news of the lack of budget in the empress's palace spread throughout the palace like a fire in a dry field. A message arrived at the empress's palace that Lionel had been appointed as the empress's assistant, and it was a counterfire from the empress. The maids discussed the topic of Lionel becoming the empress's assistant. They said that this was a very important event, but still they were more concerned about how the young master would now get married. The man looked at the young man and asked why he made such a decision. Lionel said it was a very good chance. He looked at him and asked if it wasn't worth doing everything possible. The man sighed heavily and said that, as expected, it was Lionel's decision and not the Duke's. Lionel looked at the man with a smile and asked how his brother could give him such an order. Lionel smiled and said he would be on his way. The cool autumn wind is perfect for lazing around. The maids were on guard, but near the Empress, because she looked very frightening. It seemed to them that she was always watching them. The Empress, in turn, lay quietly on the sofa. Hannah knew that it was convenient to be in the eyes of other tyrants, that it was worth being attentive to the maids. Hannah looked at the maids and told them to stop doing their business and leave quickly. The maids obediently agreed. The Empress looked at the Hannah and asked if these children would run less to the ivory palace to make denunciations. Hannah said that they had not visited the ivory palace in the past week. The Empress sighed heavily and said that it seemed there was nothing to talk about, but she remembered what happened last night. A moment later, the maid went to the Empress and said that an assistant had arrived. Lionel arrived at the Empress's and greeted her with a smile. The Empress smiled and also greeted him. She said that she had been waiting for him very much. Lionel looked at the Empress in surprise. A moment later, the Empress told the maid to serve the drinks colder. The maids looked at the Empress in surprise and said that they would do everything now. The Empress looked at the young man and said that rumors would soon spread throughout the imperial palace. She said that there would be rumors about Her Majesty's close relationship with her assistant. The Empress looked at him and said that she liked him very much as an assistant. She said with a smile that they could get along in the future. He looked at her and agreed. The Empress noticed that he was feeling tense. She said that it was not easy to pretend to be friendly, and since they had come this far, he should give longer answers, since it would be very awkward if rumors were spread that the Empress was making unrequited court to Lionel. The young man looked at the Empress in surprise and said that he would make sure that she did not regret her choice of assistant. The Empress smiled and said that they would certainly remember his words, but she still found it interesting to tease him. The Empress looked at him and pushed a plate of cakes towards him. She said that these were the most delicious cakes in the empire, so he should try them. Lionel looked at her and said there was no need to rush. She looked at him in surprise and asked if it was really unreasonable to push snacks under his nose for a treat. She said that this was the first time this had happened to her before. A moment later, an incomprehensible silence reigned between them. The Empress looked at him and said that she wanted to pull the pendulum of the force, which was currently leaning towards the magicians. Lionel looked at her and said that this was definitely worth doing. Lionel looked at the Empress and said that also changes need to be made to the way they fight the towers. He said that currently, all information about the tower is monopolized by the mages and is not disclosed. The Empress said that in that case the tower is the pendulum of power. Now she realized that this was what her mother wanted. She told her that the tower was an opportunity. If she used the power correctly, then the imperial family would rise monopolize and not share information. Even the necessary rescue work was done in a way that would bring benefits. Adelaide understood that the mages now had a deadly weapon in their hands. She looked at her assistant and said that fortunately their goals coincided, and she would take advantage of the fact that she was a mage and try to strengthen her political position, so she also needed to cooperate with her. The Empress looked at the assistant's wedding and said that she had one thing to do. Before that, Lionel looked at her and said that if the Empress's palace's additional budget was cancelled, an official objection would be sent from the Valdor Duchy. The Empress looked at him and said with a smile that she really liked what she heard. She looked at him and asked if such a soft protest could really be called real revenge. She looked at him and said that she had been insulted very basely and that she should still respond in kind. The Empress showed her assistant the document and told him to read it first. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted to answer with fire. The Empress looked at him and said with a smile that everything was correct. The maid looked at the man in surprise and said that they had not been informed about this. The man said that he knew about it. He looked at the maid and said that Her Majesty just needs to choose what she wants, and it is a kind of gift. The maid looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect him to say something like that. He said it was a gift from Lady Diana. The ivory palace paid for everything the man said. He brought a letter sent to Her Majesty. The Empress carefully read the letter that was sent to her. Hannah looked at the Empress in surprise and asked what was in the letter. The Empress sighed heavily and said that there was the price of one horse. Diana wrote to the Empress what she could buy there, what she wanted for the amount that was added, since it was necessary to prepare for the upcoming national holiday. The Empress said that she was so noble that she would just burst into tears now. The Empress was shocked as she understood that the concubine was simply provoking her. Now, the Empress said that she did not intend to tolerate this any longer, looked at the Countess, and said that she was going to issue an order, so it was necessary to prepare all the necessary documents. Adelaide was in shock because she realized that for a moment she had lost control. Lionel looked at the Empress in surprise and asked if she was really going to immediately give the order to evict Diana. The kitty looked at him in surprise and asked if there was another good way. Lionel said that if she threw it out like that, she might feel sympathy for Diana. Adelaide looked at him in surprise and asked what he was suggesting. Then, he looked at her and asked what she thought about this plan. Diana sighed heavily and said that His Majesty was too kind to her. She asked if the budget supplement had been cancelled. She said with a grin that Her Majesty must be very sad. Diana looked at the man and said that the amount she added to her could even buy a necklace, but the Empress refused. Diana looked at the man and asked what the Empress would be doing at the national holiday in a few months. Diana said with a grin that she was very embarrassed. She said that His Majesty had given her a budget for the Empress's palace so that she could buy whatever she wanted. The man said with a smile that her soul was as beautiful as her face. No wonder His Majesty the Emperor favored her so much. The young people also said that they were impressed by her beautiful heart and were amazed by the love that the Emperor gave her. Diana said with a smile that she felt very awkward. After they told her all this, she hoped that they understood who was the real power of this palace. Lionel looked at the Empress intently and asked what she thought of such a plan. He looked at her and asked what she thought about it. The Empress was amazed to the depths of her soul. She thought it was simply amazing. A man with such an indifferent expression on his face came up with such a brilliant plan. She looked at him and asked with a smile if the decision to become her assistant was really his. The young man said he was making a formal objection to the rejection of the supplementary budget at today's meeting. She smiled and said she would wait. She looked at him with a smile and said that they could have a little fight. Diana was surprised. She didn't understand why she was so excited. She knew that before this, it was not like this. She chose and bought things that exceeded the budget. The merchants made a noise with their compliments and flattery. Last night, His Majesty unexpectedly visited her and also suddenly disappeared and then came again. She was surprised and did not understand why he slept at night and did not even touch her. She wondered why he suddenly behaved like this. A moment later, she called the maid. The maid ran into the room and asked her mistress if she had called her. Diana looked at the maid and told her to immediately bring the maid from the Empress's palace here. The maids looked at Diana in surprise and asked if she had called them. Diana looked at them and asked if His Majesty had come to the Empress's palace yesterday. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Diana looked at the maid with a grave face and asked if His Majesty had come to the Empress's palace. The maid looked at the young lady with fear and said that he had come. Diana looked at the maid in shock and asked how many times he came. The maid said that the Emperor came to her twice. Diana looked at the maid in shock and told her to tell about each time. The maid said that both times he came to her yesterday evening. The maid said that Her Majesty the Empress had just taken a bath and he left and was very angry, but returned less than an hour later, and after some time he left, again was in shock because she realized that the Emperor was in the Empress's palace, and then came to her. She remembered his violet eyes were full of delight. His breathing was uneasy. Diana was shocked because she knew that expression Only she knew it. She was furious because she knew that in the future, only she would know such an expression on the emperor's face. She wondered why he was fed up with such an expression on his face. P ran to the Empress. Diana looked in the mirrors. She thought that she had more wrinkles. She didn't have the same shine. She knew that His Majesty liked her skin. She understood now that she needed to call a beautician, not traders. Diana thought that she could gain weight. She understood that she needed to lose those extra pounds. She was in shock and didn't understand why they still didn't have children. She knew that neither she nor His Majesty were infertile. She screamed with rage and wondered why all this was happening. Hannah looked at the Empress and said that one maid was taken to the Ivory Palace. She said that she saw this and also asked Hannah if she had any questions. Hannah looked at the Empress, asked what she should do, whether she needed to hire new maids. The Empress looked at her and asked if there were any suitable people for this job. Hannah said that they could find and hire people she could trust. The Empress said that everything was fine, and also asked her if she could trust anyone completely. The Empress said that it was better to have those people with them that they already knew about anyway. The Empress finished writing the order. She was a little surprised and puzzled, since this was her first order. The man said that the residents of the Kelvin district are currently evacuating to nearby Barutold, and Count Barutold and Viscount Orlean are holding off monsters along the way in the middle of the path. The calculated scale of the tower is the 3rd level. The appearance of flying gargoyles of the 3rd type is confirmed. Lennox looked at the man in surprise and asked who was assessing the tower. Lennox said that they didn't see gargoyles, but garniers. Gargoyles are not that easy to catch. He looked at everyone present and asked how the knights were coping without wizards. The knight looked at the magician with anger and asked what he had just said about knights. He asked if magicians were so kind-hearted. Why were they sitting here and not dealing with the witch beasts? Lennox looked at the knight with anger and asked what he had just said. The Duke looked at Lennox and told him to stop arguing and calm down, since His Majesty was here. The young man in turn asked the Emperor for forgiveness. The Emperor looked at the Minister of Defense and asked what he thought about it. The Emperor was irritated because the Minister of Defense had always irritated him, and he didn't like him, but today he especially didn't like him. The Emperor looked at him and told him to answer what was the best way for them to act in this situation. For a moment everyone looked at the Emperor. They were surprised the Minister of Defense looked at the Emperor and asked before he answered if he could ask a few questions. The Emperor looked at everyone present and said that he could ask as many questions as he wanted. Lionel looked at them and said that on the day the tower descended to the imperial palace, he led his knights and waited for the arrival of the magicians. He said that the tower was approaching quite quickly. It was very unexpected, but the Empress responded immediately. The Emperor was angry. He wondered how the Minister of Defense dared to talk about the Empress in front of him now. The Minister of Defense said that His Majesty the Empress rode the ascending current and single-handedly destroyed the tower before it came down to earth. Thanks to this, not a single demon came out of the tower, and there were no victims. He looked at everyone present and said that this method had never been thought of in their empire. Lennox looked at the Minister of Defense and said that such words were very interesting, and it seemed that the Empress was very favorably disposed towards him. Lionel said that when the flying monster appeared to Her Majesty, the Empress said that measures should be taken for the 3rd level. She advised the Count to evacuate the residents to another territory. Thanks to her support, he decided to do this. All those present were surprised, for it was the first time they had heard that Her Majesty the Empress had supported the Count, and some said that they knew that she had given him a gold bar. Lionel looked at the Emperor intently and said that he was now returning to the questions. I looked at the Emperor intently and asked why only the magicians could see the current situation. Looking at the magicians, he asked if they didn't want to save them, or if they weren't capable of it. Lionel looked at the Emperor and said that, as Minister of Defense, he had come to say a few words. He said he believed that if they could do their job, they should send them out right now to help. The emperor thought for a moment and looked intently at the Minister of Defense. The young man looked at the emperor. He said that he wanted to know His Majesty's opinion on one matter. He said that the current Empress should be given the appropriate power. He asked on what basis the additional Her Majesty was cancelled. The emperor said that after the appearance of the lover, the Empress began to be mentioned frequently. The emperor said that there is a saying that people need to know their place. Even commoners say that their wives help their husbands. The emperor asked if it was not necessary to assess the situation correctly. He looked at the Minister of Defense and asked if that was true. The emperor, in turn, looked intently at the Minister of Defense. Lionel glanced sideways at the emperor, but said nothing. His brother looked at the emperor and said that he was too harsh. A moment later, a servant entered and called the emperor. The emperor looked at him in surprise and asked what happened. The servant came closer to the emperor. The servant said that the Empress had revoked Diana's permission to live in the ivory palace. The emperor was shocked from such a statement. He looked at the servant and asked what he was talking about. The emperor, in turn, looked closely at the decree that the Empress had issued. He wondered if she had really issued such an order. He saw that the document had her seal. The young brothers looked closely at the emperor, as they expected to see his reaction. Diana's brother said furiously that this simply could not be, since permission had been obtained from His Majesty, the emperor. He was furious and could not think that the Empress was trying to expel his sister. The servant looked at everyone and said that according to the palace law, Her Majesty the Empress has the right to approve a residence permit in the imperial palace, but from now on, in recognition of her service to His Majesty, the Emperor Lady Diana is allowed to reside in the ivory palaces. Everyone was whispering because they didn't understand what was being discussed. They said that, in essence, nothing had changed then. The servant looked at them and said that, however, according to his palace legislation, such a residence could not be managed by someone who is not a member of the imperial family or a person who did not hold a position. If Diana wishes to stay, she must admit herself to being a guest in the palace, and for the accommodation in the ivory palace, the countess must pay the appropriate fee. The emperor glanced sideways at the servant, but said nothing. Lennox looked at the staff in surprise. He was furious. He understood that they could not pay such a huge amount. The young man looked at the emperor with fury, as he expected him to take appropriate action. The emperor, in turn, stood up and simply walked out of the hall. The young men whispered among themselves, as they understood that you were indeed right, wondering why a lonely lady occupied one of the palaces of the imperial family. They said that Her Majesty the Empress had distributed everything correctly, but if anyone wanted to be a concubine, she needed to be paid the appropriate money. Diana's brother was furious at what he had heard at the moment. The brothers glanced sideways at Lennox. They knew the storm was about to break. He looked at his brother and asked if it was his idea about the dress for renting the ivory palace. Lionel looked at his brother and said with a smile that he seemed to know him well. The young man still thought that his brother was just a cunning boy, since he made mistakes that he then corrected with his own ease. Lionel looked at his brother and called him. Lionel said that he needed to tell him something. The emperor stormed into the Empress's palace in a rage. The maids looked at the emperor and greeted him. A moment later, the emperor saw the Empress, and he looked at her intently and angrily. He looked at her in surprise and asked where she was going looking like that. The Empress came closer to him and asked if something had happened that he had come to her. The emperor angrily told her to withdraw. The Empress looked at him in surprise and asked with a smile if he was talking about the ivory palace. The Empress said that in that case, His Majesty should be the first to be recalled. The Empress looked at the emperor with a smile and asked where the problem was. In her decree, she said that she was not kicking out the young lady and she could live there if she wanted, but for an appropriate amount, and asked the emperor if there was a more legal option than this. The emperor looked at her with fury and said that he would not warn her any more. He shouted and told her to withdraw the decree immediately. The empress looked at him and said that His Majesty should do it first. She looked at him and said with a smile that he knew what happened today. Emperor Charles looked at the empress with surprise and anger. The empress said the price of one horse. She said there were traders sent from the Ivory Palace. They said since her extra budget was cancelled, maybe she could buy something for that price. The empress said, of course, she sent them back. She said, whoever took out a knife should be fought with a knife. She looked at the emperor and said that she had heard that there was such a saying in his empire. The empress knew that her husband would no longer stop her and would not cancel anything because he had given her nothing. The empress bowed and was about to leave. The emperor of grayness pounced on her and asked where she was going. The empress looked at him and said that she was traveling incognito. He looked at him in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The empress looked at her husband and said that Article 14, Paragraph 2 of the palace law, the empress may, without the emperor's permission, go outside the imperial palace and engage in secret activities. She said that she had the right not to tell him where and why she was going. Karl looked at her with fury and asked if she had really learned all this palace law. The empress asked him what else she needed to do. She said that she did not have money even for one horse. The empress pushed him away and told him to let her go. Now she said she wanted to know how the common people lived in the empire, and to understand this, it was best to see everything with her own eyes. She said it would take about 1 or 3 days. The emperor stared after her furious. The operator genuinely wanted to restrain her. He wanted to put a leash around this woman's neck and immobilize her. He wanted to bury his nose in her snow-white neck. The emperor wanted to deeply inhale her scent, similar to a spring flower. Emperor Charles was furious, and looking at the departing empress, he cursed. The servant looked at the empress and opened the door for her. He asked for forgiveness and said that she could rest in the carriage. The brothers looked at the man in surprise. They wanted to know if there were high-ranking guests in the carriage. The man looked at them and said that there were. The Duke looked at the man and told him to act as if nothing had happened, and the man obediently followed the order. Lionel walked slowly into the carriage. He was a little surprised. The Empress looked at them and asked for forgiveness for their rudeness. Since they had to travel in some kind of abandoned carriage, she greeted them. The Duke looked at her and said that it was a great honor for him to meet her. The Empress looked at them and said that as he had probably already heard from the Minister of Defense, she would most likely stay for a couple of days. Lionel looked closely at the Empress. He was glad that she was going with them. The Empress looked intently out the window as she wanted to take a closer look at everything. Lionel couldn't take his eyes off the Empress. He hadn't seen such light clothes and boots for a long time. He knew that this was the perfect cover. The Empress looked out the window and asked if this was the standard of living of ordinary people in the capital. The Duke looked at her and asked if she liked it. The Empress did not answer, but simply looked out the window. A moment later she said that the clothes were neat, the colors were appropriate. She did not know what the houses looked like from the inside, but from the outside they were very clean. It seemed that all the minimum needs of the people were met, but it did not reach the middle class. The Empress looked at them and asked what they thought. She said Gautroff was well off. She asked what about Amont. The Duke said that Amont, like this area, is considered middle class. About 10 minutes away, further north across the river, are the slums. This is the only place where refugees who lost their homes from the tower can find shelter. The Duke said that slums were currently appearing and expanding in many provinces. The Empress was a little puzzled, but still understood that it was inevitable. The Duke looked at the Empress and asked if he could clarify why she had helped the Count anyway. The Empress said that it was the least she could do for the people, although it probably did not help the Count himself much. Lionel looked at her and asked if she had by any chance conducted rescue operations in her home country. The Empress said that she was the founder and head of the headquarters to counter the towers. The young people froze in bewilderment. They were shocked by what the Empress told them. She looked at them and said that this continued until last year. She ran with all her might, thinking that she had to destroy the tower before it falls to the ground, before it pours out into demonic monsters that trample people. The woman looked at the princess and thanked her. She said that they survived only thanks to her. The young girl approached the princess and gave her the wreath with a smile. She also thanked the princess for saving her. Even now, those feelings are still so clear that it gives you a chill. Save everyone without giving up. Have a conscience. Be polite to people. This is the ideology that the Empress chose when she founded the headquarters against the tower. She looked at them and asked if she answered their question. The young men froze in place. They did not know what to answer her, but still looked at her intently without looking away. The Empress arrived at the duchy's estate. She was surprised as the estate was beautiful. Lionel smiled and thanked the Empress for the compliment. Adelaide said that the compliment was sincere. The Empress looked at Lionel and called him. He looked at her. Adelaide looked at the young man and asked if there were many books in the duchy. He smiled and said that they had many books, and also many people were fond of collecting books. The Duke was perplexed as he heard the Empress call his brother by name. The Duke wondered how close they were. He asked himself furiously if his brother had really decided to become the Empress's lover. The Empress looked at Lionel and asked if that meant there should be a library here. Lionel asked if she wanted to visit it. The Empress said that there was a library in the imperial palace, but she could not visit it because of the current situation. She looked at Lionel and asked if he could recommend her any books. He looked at hers and said that if she told him what exactly she wanted, he could recommend it to her. The Empress looked at the Duke and said that she needed to get permission from the owner of the library. The Empress froze as she saw the Duke's face. He looked very distracted. The Empress wondered if the Duke thought she was being dismissive towards Lionel. Now the Empress knew she was just trying to pretend to be his brother's mistress, and it would be difficult to justify how it looked from the outside. The Empress looked at the Duke and said with a smile that they could be dismissive. The Duke froze in place. He did not understand what the Empress was talking about. The Empress was in shock because she said something she did not want. She wanted to say that they could look at the library, but unfortunately everything was mixed up. Lionel stood quietly and laughed on the sidelines. The Duke looked at the Empress and said that the library was on the second floor of the annex. He said that she could use it at her pleasure during her stay here. Lionel looked at the Empress and said with a smile that he would take her to the library. Lionel, and as he walked with her, he saw that her ears were red. He wondered if something like that could happen to Her Majesty. Hannah looked at Diana and told her to consult with the head of the house about the imperial palace. Hannah told Diana to make a decision as soon as possible and let them know whether she would return to the palace or stay as a guest. Diana froze in bewilderment. She was shocked by the statement. Hannah looked at Diana and said she wanted to show her the order from Her Majesty the Empress. After reading the decree, Diana was perplexed, wondering if she really had to leave the ivory palace. Hannah looked at her and said that no one was throwing her out. Right now, Diana said that this was a palace granted to her by His Majesty the Emperor. Diana looked at Hannah and asked how the Empress dared to cancel the Emperor's order without his permission. Hannah was furious. She looked at Diana and asked how dare she say such a thing. She said that it was an order from Her Majesty the Empress, and she had every right to do so. She was furious because the Empress was everywhere. She said that she was here on behalf of His Majesty, so she would never leave the ivory palace. Hannah looked at her and asked if this meant that Diana would rent this palace. Hannah said that the rent amount for the entire ivory palace would be calculated and sent to the count. Hannah asked her to pay the rent to the financial department of the imperial palace at the end of each month. Hannah looked at Diana and said that, as she had said earlier, the palace legislation stated that the decision on the issue of residence in the imperial palace was the right of Her Majesty the Empress. This meant that the Empress could cancel His Majesty's decrees and issue new ones without his permission. Hannah looked at the maids and said that the maids of the ivory palace would also be transferred to other places. Diana looked at Hannah with fury and asked what this all meant. Hannah said that managing the staff of the imperial palace is also the right of Her Majesty, the Empress. Diana was furious. She still did not understand what was going on. Diana knew that the emperor's love for her could not be so weak before the law. After all that was said, Hannah slowly left the chambers. Diana, in turn, shouted for her to settle down. Diana came closer to Hannah and told her to tell the Empress that she would regret it if she treated her like that. Diana asked if she thought the Emperor would allow her to leave the ivory palace. Diana saw that in those eyes there was open contempt. The eyes of an aristocrat who asked her how she dared to treat her like that. Diana did not want to see those eyes. Because of that, she kicked her out, and she looked at the Khan and asked if she thought that the emperor would allow her to humiliate her. Diana said that the emperor would never allow that. Diana looked at Hannah and said that she knew better than anyone the reason for this. Hannah looked at Diana and said with a smirk that she had wrinkles. Diana froze in place in bewilderment and shock. She looked at the young lady and said that she had wrinkles around her eyes and around her mouth, but she didn't have them before. Hannah said she thought she would soon have more, as her thin skin was prone to wrinkles. Hannah said she knew what weapon she used to win His Majesty over to her side. Hannah said with a grin that she definitely looked like one, but there was no need to remind her of that. Diana angrily told her to shut up and stop chattering like a snake. Hannah looked at Diana and asked when Lady Beatrice died. Hannah said she died at 29. Diana froze in shock. Hannah said she was so young she didn't have a single wrinkle. You remember, His Majesty, she was 29. Her blooming image would never grow old for him. Hannah looked at the young lady and said that her time would soon be up, unlike Lady Beatrice. Hannah looked at Diana and said that it would be better to use the money she sent to the Empress and use it for a beautician. Perhaps that way she could get rid of her wrinkles. Hannah looked at her and asked with a smirk how many blonde, blue-eyed women there were younger than her. Diana froze in place. From what she heard, she was in shock. Diana stood frozen in place, wondering how many girls like her would want to take their place in the Emperor's heart in the same way. Bright and beautiful surroundings. She had achieved all this from scratch. She was furious. She knew she would not let anyone pick up her. She wondered how dare they throw her out of the palace. Diana understood that the Empress had nothing but a fictitious title, while she stood next to His Majesty and ruled this palace. She remembered the moment when she told the Emperor with a smile that she wanted to be his only wife. She knew that he did not agree to this. She was in shock. She did not understand why he was making her so unhappy. She was in shock. She did not understand why all this was happening to her. She knew that the Empress did not even have real power. The young lady looked in the mirror and told herself that she would not cry anymore because the wrinkles would only get worse. She knew that she had to smile and that she needed to take care of her beautiful face immediately. A moment later, she called the maid. She told her to call a beautician to her immediately. The Empress was sitting quietly in the library, reading a book. A moment later, she heard a knock on the door. The Duke looked at the Empress and asked with a smile if she would like to dine with them. The Empress smiled and said that she did not mind, since she was already about to leave. The Duke looked at the Empress and asked if she liked everything he said, that since her visit was ordered to be kept secret, the food was a little meager. The Empress smiled and said that was enough. She looked at them and said that now they could ask their questions. The Duke was a little surprised, as he saw that she was still as straightforward. Lionel looked at the Empress and asked if he could ask about the destruction of the tower. The Empress smiled and said that, of course he could. He looked at her and said, that day, she said that this tower is level 4, which is close to level 5, so they can't wait. He looked at her, asked if she can handle a tower level 4 and below alone. The Empress said she could handle the 5th level towers and below, but not the top level towers. Lionel said she destroyed the tower before it fell to the ground. He asked if she did the same in her empire. The Empress said that 5 years ago she accidentally discovered this method. Since then, her #1 rule, when destroying towers, is to destroy them before they fall to the ground. The Empress said the problem was that few mages could ride the updraft like she could, so about half the towers were destroyed before they hit the ground, with the rest having to be dealt with after they fell. The Duke said the damage was incomparable. The Empress said that if it was destroyed before it fell to the ground, there was no loss unless the attackers made a mistake by falling. The Duke looked at the Empress and asked what she thought of the tower, which had finally touched the ground. He asked her if it was possible to control her. The Empress looked at him in surprise and said that it was definitely not possible. The Duke looked at her and asked if she was sure about this. The Empress looked at the Duke in surprise and said that such a thing had never happened. Lionel looked at the Empress and asked if she could spare him a little time. A moment later, he unfolded the map in front of her. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand why he brought a map of the Empire. A moment later, the Empress saw that there were many red stones on the map. The Empress looked at them in shock and asked if these were all towers. She was taken aback and asked in a trembling voice if they really meant to say that these were all the red stones of the tower. Lionel looked at her and said that it was correct, and that these were all the towers in the Empire that were under control. She was shocked because she realized that many towers had been left unattended under the pretext that everything was under control. The Empress looked at them and said that if these were all towers, then it meant that the Empire was now in total hell. Lionel looked at her and said that it was true that the Empire was in hell. At the moment, he looked at her and asked for help. He said that they needed the help of Her Majesty the Empress. The Empress, in turn, froze in place. She was surprised and amazed by what she learned. Diana sat intently in front of the mirror and looked at all her wrinkles. The maid came in and told her with a smile that His Majesty the Emperor had arrived. Diana smiled and asked if the Emperor had come to see her. A moment later, the Emperor entered the concubine's room. She came out to him, exhausted, without raising her head. She said that he had come to her. After all, he was a little puzzled, since she was exhausted again. Pale face and lips, as if there was no blood in them. Thin neck, as if it was about to break. It seemed to him that she was on the verge of death, just like that dying man. His heart was beating very hard. He had difficulty breathing, as if he was falling into a deep and dark sea. Diana knew that the Emperor was undoubtedly angry. She knew that he hated the Empress, who wanted to drive her out of the ivory palace. She wondered how much he pitied her, as she had suffered greatly from the Empress. She knew that he had come to comfort her. She knew that he loved her. The Emperor looked at her intently. A moment later, Diana said she was okay. The Emperor looked at the concubine and asked if she had sent an envoy to the Empress's palace today. Diana looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The Emperor looked closely at the concubine and said that he asked if she had sent a messenger to the palace. The operator asked if she had really offered the Empress the price of 1 horse. The young lady was shocked and did not understand why he was behaving like this with her. She saw that he was not worried about her, but interrogating her. She was trembling and said that it would not work with Her Majesty the Empress. She said that the whole budget was poorly planned. Diana was like, how would the Empress buy jewelry and dresses? Then she said she was stupid, but there was no better way. She looked at him with tears in her eyes and asked how she dared to do that to the Empress. She said she agreed on the price. He said. She looked at him and said that this was money given by His Majesty. Diana asked him for forgiveness. The Emperor looked at her intently and said nothing. A moment later, he pushed her away and said that there was no benefit in provoking the Empress. He looked at her and said that she had told him earlier that his love alone was enough for her. Diana froze in surprise. She was in shock. She didn't know what to answer him. The Emperor looked at the concubine with a glare and angrily and told her to remember his words. As long as she remembered them, he would protect her. The Emperor looked at her intently and told her to free the ivory palace. Diana froze in shock. The Emperor said that he would prepare a place for her in his palace. and she could move there. He said that the Empress would not get to her there. He looked at her and said that if she was not happy with this, she could return to the county. The young lady looked at the Emperor and rushed towards him. She was in shock and screamed at him not to leave her. The Emperor looked angrily at the young lady and furiously told her not to say those words. He looked at her with contempt and said that she was becoming more and more like his mother. Diana froze in bewilderment. She was shocked by what had happened. The Duke looked at the Empress and said with a smile that the butlers would take her to the restroom. And he also said that she could let him know if she was uncomfortable. The Empress looked at the butler and with a smile asked him to take care of her. He smiled and said that it was an honor for him. The Empress looked at the Duke and said with a smile that they would see each other tomorrow, and the Duke wished her good night. Adelaide looked at Lionel and wished him sweet dreams. Lionel looked at the Empress with a smile and also wished her sweet dreams. Maybe it was because of the rush of thoughts, but she couldn't sleep. A lot had happened since her arrival in the Empire. The Empress knew that she still had a lot of things to deal with. She knew that after such a shocking story, it was difficult for her to fall asleep. In turn, he also could not sleep. He wondered whether he should read a book. A moment later, he saw that the light in Her Majesty's room was on. He wondered what she was doing, that she was still awake. Suddenly, Lionel heard a knock on the window. He went out onto the terrace to see the source of the noise. He looked in surprise and saw the Empress. He wondered if she was uncomfortable in the room. The Empress looked at him and asked with a smile if he knew where the drink was. The Empress looked at the young man in surprise and asked why he was still not sleeping. He didn't know what to answer and hesitated because he was simply still thinking about her, but still he couldn't answer her and admit that she occupied his thoughts. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she was suddenly looking for alcohol. The Empress was surprised as he changed the subject. She smiled and said that she just couldn't sleep. Lionel said that it was not good to depend on alcohol. The Empress sighed and said that she was not always dependent on it, but still sometimes when she could not sleep, she drank a little. The Empress said that there was enough fire already, and she would only take alcohol after she drank. She would clean everything up and leave. Lionel looked at her and asked what she would like to drink. The Empress thought for a moment and said that she would like to drink the moonshine without ice and without water. To dilute it, she said that she did not need snacks either. Lionel said it would be too strong. The Empress said it was okay, as she had drunk it like that many times before. He looked at her and said it was getting into her system, so it needed to be diluted. She looked at him and told him to leave it because he was grumbling too much. He looked at her in surprise. The Empress looked at him and asked if he would like to join her. The young man looked at her and said that he didn't want to. She smiled and said that it meant for her to drink alone. Lionel was surprised because he knew it was a very bitter and poisonous thing. The Empress sighed heavily and said that she felt very good. The Empress looked at him and thanked him. Lionel looked at the Empress in surprise. She looked at him and said that before they could properly understand the situation in the Empire, they would have to face hostility and confrontation. She looked at him, said that now the main problem, the Empress said that thanks to him, her situation became much better. The Empress said that she was still a little tired. She said that she could not sleep, unfortunately, because she had too many thoughts in her head, so she was constantly getting drunk. He looked at her and said with a smile that he knew that what he was about to say was probably not on topic. Lionel said he thought she was being very brave in the way she dealt with her problems. The Empress was surprised, but she still thanked him for such warm words. She said that his words gave her strength. He smiled and said that he was very glad that he could help her. A moment later, she was distracted by the sight of a beautiful painting. The Empress asked if it was a portrait of the Duke. Lionel said it was. A moment later, her gaze was drawn to the cute little child. She said that in the picture, he looked like a mischievous boy. Lionel said that his father once told him that he was a troublemaker and he was scared to death of his antics. The Empress laughed and asked what about him. She said she wanted to see what he was like as a child. She said he must have been very cute. He looked at her and said that he was glad that he was lucky enough to meet her. Right now, the Empress looked at her in surprise and asked why he thought so. He sighed heavily and said that a child could not become her assistant and probably would not even be a candidate. The Empress smiled and said that such a beautiful baby would be next to her. Lionel was shocked. He saw the beautiful Empress, her eyes shining in the moonlight. Her Majesty, the Empress, who should be a ruthless monster dominating the people. But now she just smiles at little things. He looked at her intently because he knew she looked absolutely beautiful. The Empress looked at him in surprise as he stared at her and said nothing. The young man looked away from the Empress in embarrassment. He was puzzled and wondered what he was thinking. The Empress looked at Lionel in surprise. She did not understand why he blushed. She looked at him closely, as he was more handsome than she thought. The Empress thought that it might be because of the alcohol. She looked at him and said that if he had any questions, he could ask her now. She said that he could answer one question that he had not dared to ask the Empress before, and that would be the price for the drink. He looked at her and said that she was the main one at the headquarters of the whole tower action. He looked at her and asked why she didn't get married in her empire. She smiled and asked if this was her payment for the alcohol. He said that if she did not want to answer, then he would not insist, and also asked for forgiveness. She looked at him and said that it wasn't that. She said that the world could not be as harmonious as their family portraits hanging on the walls. She remembered her brother, who greeted her with a smile, and asked if she had received his letter. The Empress said that her father had died of a chronic illness, and that her mother, in the midst of the chaos, had suddenly decided to accept the marriage proposal and told her to leave for Aemont. The Empress said that in fact she could not refuse. He looked at her in surprise and asked why. She smiled and said that in this way she was forgiven. He was confused and didn't understand what had happened at all, and why she had such a sad face. He couldn't fully understand her words, but he couldn't ask either. The Empress smiled and said that this was her payment for the alcohol, and they should go back already. Lionel looked closely at the Empress. He saw that her body was very fragile. The Emperor, in turn, sat in his chambers and quietly sang drinks. He remembered his coronation and how everyone congratulated him. The Duke looked at him and said that he had become the most respected man in this world. The Duke said that the whole world belonged to him, and he could do as he pleased. The Emperor was confused. He did not understand why on such a day, thoughts and memories of childhood were so clearly emerging in his head. He was very angry and did not understand where she had gone. The servant said that due to the lack of budget for the Empress's palace, she currently doesn't even have knights or personal ladies-in-waiting to help her. And even the Countess said she didn't know anything. The maids in the palace were busy with their own affairs when the Empress left. The Emperor was angry. He wondered why the Empress's whereabouts were unknown. He wondered if it was all because he had not allocated a budget for her palace. But he knew that if he thought about it, the answer to that question was very simple. He knew that she was heading to the Valdor family. The events of the previous night were so clear in his mind, as if everything had just happened, that he was still unable to sleep. Lionel remembered her ringing laughter, which still sounded in his ears. The Empress looked at them and greeted them with a smile on her face. The Duke looked at her and asked if she had slept well. The Empress looked at Lionel and asked if he had slept well. She said that she had slept well thanks to him. Lionel was surprised, but still he couldn't take his eyes off her gentle smile. The Duke was in shock. He didn't understand what had happened at all, as he saw that the atmosphere between them had changed. He wondered what had happened last night.